Disney. Just the word invokes feelings of magic and childlike wonder. Or, if you're more cynical, it invokes the feelings of a multi-billion-dollar corporation that's slowly but surely taking over the entertainment industry. But we're not here to talk about Disney's monopoly. We're here to look at the studio that started it all. Long before Disney owned almost every major IP in existence, the company started out in a garage in California with a young man from Marceline, Missouri. Since then, Walt Disney Animation Studios has produced some of the most iconic and widely beloved films of all time. These movies have always been a major part of my life. Without them, I wouldn't have the passion for animation that I do now. So, back at the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020, with the sudden free time I had, I decided to do something I had wanted to do for a long time. Watch every animated Disney film in order of release, starting with Snow White and ending with their most recent movie at the time, Frozen 2. It helped that I had just gotten Disney Plus, which allowed me to easily access almost all of their films. Over the course of 2 months, I basically watched one Disney movie every day, and at the same time, I reviewed each one on my Letterboxd account. I'll link my account in the description if you want to read them. I had so much fun doing this that, well, I decided to do it again. And since the studio is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, I figured it would be the perfect time to do so. In this video, I'll not only share my thoughts and ratings on each Disney movie, but I'll also talk a bit about their history, which in my opinion is just as interesting. It's my attempt to pay tribute to a studio that has meant so much to me. Without further ado, let's begin. Before I go into the first movie though, let me give a background on Disney itself. Walter Elias Disney was born in Chicago, Illinois on December 5, 1901. Walt spent a good amount of his childhood in the small farm town of Marceline, Missouri, which he regarded as some of the happiest years of his life. Walt loved playing on the Disney farm, visiting the town's main street, and most importantly, drawing. Art quickly became a form of self-expression and escape for Walt, a way to help him get away from his overbearing father Elias and his chores on the farm. When Walt was older, he and his family moved once again to Kansas City, where his father owned delivery routes for the Star and Times papers. Walt and his siblings had to work long hours delivering papers, so once again, art provided Walt a good form of escape. When Walt was a teenager, he decided to pursue art as a career, but briefly put his plans on hold so he could enlist in World War I. After returning to the US, Walt went to art school and soon got a job with the Kansas City Film Ad Company. It was at this time when Walt discovered a new form of filmmaking called animation, which consisted of a series of drawings that would change slightly to give the illusion of movement. Excited by this new art form, Walt began producing his own cartoons along with a fellow artist named Ub Iwerks. They created a series called Laugh-O-Grams, which quickly became popular. But Walt knew that the real filmmaking capital was Los Angeles. So in 1923, Walt, Ub, and a few other artists moved to California, where Walt's brother Roy was living at the time. The two brothers formed a new studio called Disney Brothers in their uncle's garage, and thus, Walt's animation career officially began. Over the next several years, Walt and Ub produced 2 successful series of shorts. The first was the Alice comedies, which were based on Lewis Carroll's Alice stories and combined live-action actors with animation, a new innovation at the time. The second was Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, which was distributed by Universal. As the shorts became more successful, Walt was able to hire more animators and move into a bigger studio. One of the new employees was a woman named Lillian Bounds, who Walt began dating and would later marry. But just as things were starting to go well, Walt was hit with a major crisis. Charles Mintz, who distributed the Oswald shorts, had bought the rights to the character from Walt and hired away most of his animators. Heartbroken and betrayed, Walt decided to come up with a new character and promised to never sell it to anyone. This character, of course, was Mickey Mouse. Walt and Ub produced 2 silent cartoons with Mickey, but for the first one to be released, they decided to produce one of the first cartoons with synchronized sound. The result, Steamboat Willie, was released in 1928 and was an immediate sensation. Mickey quickly became one of the most widely recognized characters in the world, and later served as a symbol of hope for the US during the Great Depression. Disney produced more Mickey cartoons along with another series called Silly Symphonies. As the shorts became more successful, Walt was once again able to grow his team, and the cartoons kept getting bigger and better. But even with all this success, Walt wasn't satisfied. He didn't just want to make cartoon shorts, he wanted to produce the first feature-length animated film. There had been some feature-length cartoons in Europe, but in Hollywood they were unheard of. While Walt understood the risks, he decided to go ahead and produce his first movie, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. This film would be the studio's biggest undertaking yet, featuring more realistic animation and a new invention called the multiplane camera, which gave the backgrounds the illusion of depth. It took a total of 3 years to produce and was so expensive that it nearly bankrupted the studio. Many in Hollywood were convinced it would fail and dubbed it Disney's folly. But against all odds, when Snow White was released in 1937, it became the most successful movie of its time, being adored by critics and audiences alike, and proved that animated features could succeed in America. Snow White is a movie that means a lot to me personally. This is one of those Disney movies that I would watch endlessly as a kid. Because of that, it's hard for me to look at it objectively. Let's start with the visuals, which are honestly amazing for the time. You can tell that the animators really upped their game for this film, creating some of the most realistic animation Disney had made up to that point. In fact, it manages to mix the more realistic characters like Snow White with the more cartoony characters like the Dwarfs really well. In addition, the multiplane camera helps out a feeling of depth that had been missing from Disney cartoons up to that point. The story, while simple, is still very effective. It doesn't really run on logic as much as it affects the audience's emotions like fear, sadness, and joy. You have to keep in mind that no one in Hollywood had tried making a feature-length cartoon, so it makes sense why the story is so simple. Again, having a cartoon that can make the audience feel anything other than laughter was a huge achievement. And despite the characters being somewhat one-note, in fact Grumpy seems to be the only character with any actual development, you still manage to sympathize with them. On top of that, the evil queen is actually a really menacing villain. The scene where she transforms into an old hag used to scare the living hell out of me as a kid.
My voice. My voice. Oh, perfect disguise.
Of course, I also have to mention the songs. Tunes like Hi Ho, Someday My Prince Will Come, Whistle While You Work, and I'm Wishing have become Disney standards, and for good reason. Not only are they really catchy, but some of them even help explain what certain characters are feeling.
Someday my prince will come. Someday we'll meet again.
Overall, while Snow White is pretty simple by today's standards, it's still worth watching for its historical significance alone, and it's also just a lot of fun. And like I said, it's the movie that basically made me fall in love with Disney, so it'll always have a special place in my heart. Because of that, this movie definitely deserves a 9 out of 10. With Snow White being as huge of a hit as it was, following it up was no easy task. Walt and the animators would have to take the art of animation even further than in their previous movie. Thankfully, they did just that with Pinocchio, released in 1940. Critics at the time praised the movie for being just as good, if not better, than Snow White. Unfortunately, the movie was a box office bomb at first because of its insanely high budget and Europe being hit by World War II. But over the decades, it's become known as one of Disney's best and most famous films. Unlike Snow White, I didn't really grow up watching Pinocchio. Obviously, I was aware of its existence, but I didn't actually sit down and watch it until I was a teenager. And I'm glad I did, because Pinocchio is truly impressive for its time. Like with Snow White, Pinocchio's story relies more on emotions rather than logic. As a result, the story ends up feeling more like a string of events rather than having a clear 3-act structure. But again, it's the characters that really make the experience enjoyable. Pinocchio is a really likable character because of how naive and innocent he is, and Geppetto is both funny and sympathetic for how he wants a child of his own.
I wish that my little Pinocchio might be a real boy. Wouldn't that be nice? Just think, a real boy.
Once again, the animation is spectacular, arguably even better than in Snow White. The film is full of interesting environments, from the quaint workshop of Geppetto, to the colorful yet sleazy-looking Pleasure Island, to the dark, cavernous atmosphere of Monstro's Mouth. Another revolutionary element was its water effects, which were the most realistic ever seen in animation at the time, and would later be adapted for other films and cartoons. The songs, once again, are also extremely memorable. The most obvious example is When You Wish Upon a Star, which has since basically become Disney's theme song, and for good reason, as it's truly a beautiful melody.
When you wish upon a star, your dreams come true.
However, there are some other memorable songs like Hi Diddle Dee and I've Got No Strings, which are enjoyable in their own right.
I got no strings to hold me down, to make me fret or make me frown.
Since the Disney version, there have been a bunch of other cinematic adaptations of Pinocchio, including the recent Disney remake, which I refuse to watch.
Father, when can I leave to be on my own? I've got the whole world to see.
The only other one I've seen is the Guillermo del Toro version from last year, and while I'm not sure if I like it quite as much as the Disney version, it's still an amazing movie. However, none can deny the impact the original Pinocchio had on Disney and animation as a whole, and that's why I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. On the same year as Pinocchio, Disney released Fantasia. Even though this is only the third movie on the list, I already know it's not going to get any better. Not only is Fantasia my favorite Disney movie, but it's also my favorite animated film and one of my favorite movies, period. The film got started after Walt Disney noticed that Mickey's popularity was starting to dwindle. To keep the mouse from falling into obscurity, Walt decided to create a special Mickey short and worked with famed conductor Leopold Stokowski to make a short based on the orchestral piece The Sorcerer's Apprentice. As the two kept working on it, they decided to expand the idea into a feature film with other shorts set to classical music. The result was a true work of art, the likes of which have never been seen again. One of the reasons I love Fantasia so much is that there really isn't anything else like it. In fact, Disney tried to repeat the formula with Fantasia 2000, but in my opinion it didn't turn out as well. But we'll get to that later. But mostly, Fantasia is the perfect example of how animation is art. To this day, many see animation as just kid stuff, but Disney was proving them wrong all the way back in 1940. Every single segment features the best animation Disney had done at the time, and arguably their best animation to this day. They complement their respective music pieces beautifully, all with no dialogue outside of the host segments in between. I've heard people complain that these segments ruin the animated portions, but I disagree. I think the host plays an important role by preparing the audience for what they're about to see without spoiling too much. Right out of the gate, the Toccata and Fugue segment shows us that this is unlike any other animated film, showing beautiful abstract images that almost seem impossible for the technology they had at the time. Of course, the Sorcerer's Apprentice segment is also fantastic, and there's a reason why it's become the most famous part of the film. It combines a charming story with, once again, breathtaking animation and an amazing climax. The Rite of Spring shows some of the darkest imagery of the film, chronicling the history of all life on Earth up to when the dinosaurs went extinct, and it surprisingly matches the music really well. But if I had to pick a favorite segment, or segments, it would have to be the finale, Night on Bald Mountain and Ave Maria. These shorts almost look like moving paintings, and are the best examples of how Fantasia elevates the art of animation. Night on Bald Mountain is one of the darkest things Disney has created, in which a demon named Shurtlebaugh causes chaos on top of the titular mountain, including summoning hideous demons and other creatures. But then, the demon is vanquished by the sound of church bells, transitioning into the Ave Maria. This segment beautifully contrasts the nightmarish scene we witnessed earlier, with calming and serene images set to a beautiful piece of music. It's the perfect conclusion to an amazing experience. Fantasia is a true work of art. It doesn't need a deep story to captivate its audience. It does that by tapping into their emotions with the perfect combination of visuals and music. This is animation in its purest and best form. If you haven't watched Fantasia, you're missing out. Even if you don't like it, you can at least understand why people like me consider it a work of art. I'm more than happy to give this film a 10 out of 10. While Fantasia was a huge achievement for Disney, like Pinocchio, it initially wasn't a success and wouldn't make its money back until years later. So for the next movie, Walt wanted to do something simpler with a smaller budget that could more easily make a profit. That film was Dumbo, and sure enough, it was a great success. While Dumbo obviously isn't as ambitious as the last movie, it's still a fun and heartwarming experience. This is another Disney movie I watched a lot growing up, though probably not as much as Snow White, and it still holds up. It's definitely less ambitious than the previous three movies, but that's okay because the story still works really well. Despite being only about an hour long, it manages to be really well paced. The only downside to having a smaller budget is the animation, which clearly received a bit of a downgrade from the previous films. That being said though, the animators still did a good job with the limited resources. The circus scenes in the pink elephant sequence are especially impressive.
Look out! Look out! Pink elephants on parade! Here they come! Hippity-hoppity!
Another aspect of Dumbo that works really well is the emotional moments. You can really sympathize with Dumbo and his struggles, which is extra impressive considering that he's a completely silent character. One scene in particular that sticks out is the baby mine sequence, which is one of the biggest tearjerker scenes Disney has ever made.
Baby mine, dry your eyes. Rest your head close to my heart, never to part, baby of mine.
But of course, this movie isn't without its problematic elements. Let's talk about the crows. While these characters aren't portrayed in a negative light and actually end up being really important to the story, there's no denying that they come off as pretty racist. I mean, one of them is literally named Jim Crow. But honestly, if you can look past that, and I understand if you can't, the characters are still enjoyable by themselves. Other than that though, Dumbo has aged incredibly well and remains a fun experience, which is why I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. And in case you're wondering, no, I have not seen the remake and have no interest in doing so. The next movie, and the last one from this era, is Bambi from 1942. Walt supposedly considered this his favorite movie that he worked on, and it's easy to see why because it truly is a Disney classic. Unfortunately, when the film was first released, it was actually kind of a flop. This was mainly due to it coming out at the beginning of World War II when people weren't as interested in Disney movies and the European market was unavailable because, you know, Nazis. Thankfully though, the film would go on to get the respect it deserves in its later re-releases. One of the best aspects of Bambi is the animation. The animators did extensive research to make the animation as lifelike as possible, which included bringing real deer into the studio. The animators succeeded in creating characters that were realistic in their movements, but still had somewhat stylized designs to make them more aesthetically pleasing. They also did an amazing job with the backgrounds, which really immersed the viewer in the forest setting. It also helps that there are no on-screen human characters. But beyond the visuals is a really compelling coming-of-age story with plenty of likable characters, with my personal favorite being Thumper.
Eating greens is a special treat. It makes long ears and great big feet. But it sure is awful stuff to eat.
Throughout the film, Bambi learns the basics of life, including, later on, the darker aspects. This leads to one of the most heartbreaking scenes in Disney history, when Bambi's mother is shot and killed. This scene was brilliantly handled, going from a frantic pace with loud music to a somber, almost silent tone.
Don't look back! Keep running! Keep running!
Admittedly, outside of scenes like this, the pacing can be somewhat slow with not much going on in the story. But I don't mind that so much because, again, the movie does an amazing job of immersing us in the setting, and the likable characters make those moments more fun to watch. Bambi is a movie that was truly ahead of its time, and it's easy to see how it influenced movies like The Lion King. This movie gets a perfect 10 out of 10. After the success of Snow White, Walt had many ideas for more animated films he wanted to do. Of course, these included Pinocchio, Dumbo, and Bambi, but he and his team also began planning movies like Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan. But sadly, there were two big events that put these plans on hold. The first was the Disney studio strike of 1941, in which many of Walt's animators demanded better pay and working conditions. The strike was eventually settled, but it caused many of the studio's artists to quit, along with souring Walt's relationship with animation. The other big event was the US entering World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The war made it harder for Disney's movies to make a profit, and in addition, the US military commissioned the studio to produce some propaganda shorts for the war. The limited resources meant that the studio could only make these shorts and what were known as package films, which were compilations of different animated shorts, kind of similar to Fantasia. This started an interesting new era for the studio that lasted for the rest of the decade. The first of these new package films was Saludos Amigos, which was inspired by a goodwill tour Walt and some of his animators took through South America, partially to get away from the strike and also to help prevent the spread of Nazism in the region. Unfortunately, this is a pretty big downgrade from the last few movies. As you probably guessed, Saludos Amigos is made up of cartoons inspired by the different countries of South America. While these shorts are pretty enjoyable on their own, their quality definitely isn't on the same level as Disney's previous movies. Although it is fun to see iconic characters like Donald and Goofy in their first feature film. But the weakest part of the movie has to be the boring documentary segments in between the cartoons which talk about the animators' experiences in South America. I'm sure this must have been interesting for audiences at the time since few people in the US knew much about South American cultures, but I was just waiting for the cartoons to start. On the bright side, the movie is only 42 minutes long, making it easily the shortest animated Disney film, so at least it doesn't overstay its welcome. Overall, while Saludos Amigos has some nice animation and pretty fun cartoons, it doesn't really have much for modern audiences to relate to. And trust me, that's going to be a running theme with these package films. 5 out of 10. The next movie Disney released was The Three Caballeros, a sort of spiritual successor to Saludos Amigos. Once again, this is a series of shorts related to Latin American cultures. Only this time, it's thankfully more enjoyable than the last movie. Rather than the shorts being threaded together by boring documentary segments, the Three Caballeros has a simple overarching story about Donald getting different birthday presents, each one relating to one of the shorts. Once again, the cartoons themselves aren't especially memorable, but definitely have their moments. One aspect that did receive a clear upgrade from Saludos Amigos is the animation, which has a much more colorful and vibrant look. This also marked the first time since the Alice comedies in the 20s when Disney combined animation with live action. This was done by a process developed by Walt's old partner, iWorks, which would later be perfected in movies like Son of the South and Mary Poppins. The character Joe Carioca, one of the more enjoyable parts of Saludos Amigos, also makes a return, along with a new character named Panchito Pistoles. These characters form a great dynamic with Donald, and it's easy to see why they appeared in other media like the Grand Fiesta Tour at Epcot. Overall, The Three Caballeros certainly isn't one of Disney's best movies, but it's still much more fun and enjoyable than its predecessor, which is why I'm giving it a slightly better score of 6 out of 10. The next package film is Make Mine Music from 1946. This is definitely one of Disney's more obscure movies. In fact, as of this writing, it's the only animated Disney film not on Disney+. When looking at the movie, it's pretty easy to see why. While Make Mine Music doesn't have anything overtly offensive in it, there isn't really a lot for modern audiences to enjoy. It relies heavily on music and celebrities from the 40s, which makes it one of Disney's most dated movies. A perfect example is the segment All the Cats Join In. While it has a really nice animation style, it's all about teenagers dancing to jazz music in a malt shop. Again, how are today's kids going to relate to that? In addition, this is the only package film that doesn't have some kind of overarching theme. Instead, it's just a series of shorts. Because of that, it's hard to even classify this as a movie. As for the segments themselves, there are two in particular that stand out to me. One is the first short, Blue Bayou, which displays a serene, calming scene with beautiful animation. This short was originally planned for Fantasia, so that may explain why I like it so much. The other is the last short, Woody the Operatic Whale, which tells a heartwarming story with a surprisingly tragic ending.
Just imagine a whale singing opera on the very stage of the Met.
The rest of the shorts range from kind of fun like the aforementioned All the Cats Join In and Peter and the Wolf, to pretty boring like Without You. The shorts themselves are fine for what they are, but they would have been better off as standalone releases rather than being cobbled together like this. Make Mine Music gets a 5 out of 10. Up next is Fun and Fancy Free from 1947. This is another really nostalgic movie for me. Like Snow White, I used to watch it on VHS all the time as a kid, so as you can imagine, I'm a bit biased towards it. That being said though, this movie isn't without its flaws. Like Make Mine Music, it features a lot of references and celebrities from the 1940s, which once again makes it harder for modern audiences to connect with. However, the two segments it features, Bongo and Mickey and the Beanstalk, are still enjoyable on their own. In fact, both of these segments were originally planned as feature films before World War II hit. Bongo is a pretty enjoyable segment with a cute love story and some nice animation, but for me, the real highlight is Mickey and the Beanstalk, which is probably the main reason I watched this all the time growing up. This is so far the only time Mickey, Donald, and Goofy have been in a movie from Walt Disney Animation Studios together, and it's a lot of fun watching them. In fact, this was actually one of the last times Walt Disney voiced Mickey, since he had to give up the role after his smoking damaged his voice. Sadly, you can kinda hear him struggling with the Mickey voice here.
Yeah, fellas, I sold the cow for some magic beans.
But like I said, the short is still a lot of fun. The segments that tie the shorts together are also pretty enjoyable, featuring Jiminy Cricket from Pinocchio. Mickey and the Beanstalk is also narrated by Edgar Bergen, along with child star Luana Patton and Bergen's puppets Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snerd. Again, modern audiences would probably be unfamiliar with these stars. I know I didn't know who they were as a kid, but their commentary is still pretty enjoyable.
How would you like to hear me tell a story?
Oh, I'd love it. Wouldn't you, Charlie?
Well, no.
So while Fun and Fancy Free is a bit dated compared to other Disney movies, it's still a pretty fun experience that has a lot of nostalgic value for me, which is why I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. The next package film is Melody Time from 1948. Like Make Mine Music, this movie is simply a compilation of several animated shorts, with the only common thread being a master of ceremonies. Unlike Make Mine Music though, it's still pretty fun to watch thanks to its colorful, vibrant animation and memorable characters. This film was noteworthy for being one of the first to prominently feature the art style of Mary Blair, one of the few female animators at Disney at the time. Her colorful, vibrant style really enhances this movie's visuals, and is most apparent in the first segment, Once Upon a Winter Time. The third segment, Johnny Appleseed, also combines the traditional Disney character designs with Mary Blair's backgrounds, a technique they would perfect with movies like Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan. Some other memorable shorts include Blame It on the Samba, another short featuring Donald Duck dealing with South American culture, and the last segment, Pecos Bill, although the latter unfortunately has some outdated stereotypes. But my favorite segment is probably the second one, Bumble Boogie, which features a jazz version of Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee accompanied by some really creative animation. This was another segment originally meant for Fantasia, which again may explain why I like it so much. Many of the same issues from the previous package films still apply here, including an over-reliance on 40s celebrities and music. But like I said, the shorts themselves are still enjoyable on their own, and it has a bit more structure than Make My Music with its narrator. So while it's not perfect, Melody Time is still one of the better package films that Disney made, and I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. The last package film from Disney is The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad from 1949, and apparently Disney saved the best for last. As the title suggests, this movie is made up of two segments, one based on the classic British children's book The Wind in the Willows, and the other based on Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Each one of these segments could have easily been their own movie. In fact, The Wind in the Willows was originally planned as a feature film before World War II. This segment is a lot of fun, featuring great cartoony humor and likable characters like the titular Mr. Toad. In my opinion though, the highlight of this movie is easily the Sleepy Hollow segment. It manages to stay true to the original story by combining humor with a genuinely creepy and intense climax. It also does a great job of capturing the Halloween atmosphere. Even the songs are surprisingly catchy, even though they fall into the same trap as the other package films by having that slightly dated 40s sound.
When spoons have a midnight jamboree, they break it up with fiendish glee. Ghosts are bad, but the one that's cursed is the headless horseman, he's the worst.
As always, the animation in both segments is extremely well done. Not only do the backgrounds do a great job of representing the respective settings, but the character animation is very fluid and makes the action scenes more intense. Overall, Ichabod and Mr. Toad is easily the best package film Disney made in the 40s, and a great way to cap off this interesting era in Disney animation. 7 out of 10. The 40s were definitely a tough decade for Disney. The animator strike and World War II both put a significant damper on the projects the studio was making at the time, forcing them to turn to package films, propaganda shorts, and live-action films like 1946's Song of the South. At the same time, Walt wasn't nearly as involved with these movies as he was on projects like Snow White. These projects helped keep Disney afloat at the time, but by the time the 50s rolled in, they were wanting to take some more risks. For their next animated film, Walt wanted to go back to making another narrative feature, the studio's first since Bambi. It was a pretty big gamble at the time, but it ended up paying off, because this movie would end up making Disney more successful than they had ever been. That movie was
Cinderella, you're as lovely as your name.
Few movies have made as big of an impact on Disney as Cinderella. With the success of this film, Disney was not only able to make more animated features, but they were also able to make live-action films, invest in television, set up their own distribution company, and it helped Walt finally realize his dream of building Disneyland. This started what is often referred to as Disney's Golden Age. So, like it or not, Cinderella is an extremely important movie in Disney history. Despite that, Cinderella has never been one of my favorite Disney movies. Don't get me wrong, it's a pretty good movie, but I just don't think it's one of Disney's best. The best part of the movie is probably the animation. The artists were able to create the most vibrant and colorful animation Disney had done at that point, complete with beautiful backgrounds, great character animation, and some impressive effects, most notably in the iconic scene where Cinderella's dress transforms. Some of the side characters are also memorable, including the fairy godmother and the mice. Upon rewatch though, I found myself especially enjoying the King and the Duke. They're actually really funny.
The prince, sire, swears he'll marry none but the girl who fits this slipper.
He said that, did he?
Ha-ha! We got him!
Of course, we also have to bring up one of the most famous Disney villains, Lady Tremaine, aka the Wicked Stepmother. She definitely leaves an impression with how cruel she can be to Cinderella, complete with a great voice performance by Eleanor Audley.
Now, let me see. There's the large carpet in the main hall. Clean it. And the windows upstairs and down. Wash them. Oh, yes, and the tapestries and the draperies.
But I just finished.
Do them again.
As for Cinderella herself, she doesn't have a ton of personality, but you can definitely sympathize with her situation and how she puts up with her stepmother and stepsisters. However, my least favorite character has to be Prince Charming. He has no memorable qualities and barely any personality. In fact, he hardly has any lines of dialogue. The story can also drag a bit with a lot of filler scenes that don't really advance the plot, but this is somewhat excusable as this was Disney's first narrative animated film in a while. The songs here are pretty memorable, especially Bippity Boppity Boo, but once again, I don't really consider them to be Disney's best. In recent years, many have criticized Cinderella for not being a good role model because of how she always spends her time dreaming of having a prince rescue her. But really, I don't agree with that sentiment at all. Cinderella is constantly putting up with her family's bullying, and in the end, she's rewarded with getting a better life. I don't see how that's a bad message at all. But overall, Cinderella is a pretty fun movie that undoubtedly played a huge role in Disney history, and thus, I think it deserves a 6 out of 10. And no, I have not seen the remake and have no interest in doing so. Disney's Golden Age continued with Alice in Wonderland from 1951. Disney has a long history with Lewis Carroll's Alice stories. As mentioned earlier, one of the first cartoon series the studio produced was the Alice comedies from the early 20s. When Snow White was being made, Walt wanted to make an Alice feature film, but it had to be put on hold because of World War II. It wasn't until Cinderella became a smash hit that Disney was finally able to make an Alice in Wonderland movie. But unfortunately, it didn't turn out as well as the last film. Not only were critics mixed on the film, but it also wasn't very successful at the box office. Thankfully though, the movie would do better in its various re-releases, especially during the psychedelic period of the late 60s and early 70s. Fantasia also became popular around the same time for the same reason. Since then, the movie has become a Disney classic, appearing prominently in the parks and other media. Watching this was a breath of fresh air for me, as this is easily one of my favorite Disney movies from the Golden Age, and the best movie we've looked at since Bambi. The film manages to capture the same manic energy as Lewis Carroll's original stories, complete with some beautiful and surreal animation. Animation is truly the best way to bring these stories to life because there are no boundaries of where you can take the visuals. The film doesn't have much of a plot, instead following Alice as she encounters crazy characters and locations. That being said though, it still has some emotional weight as you really sympathize with Alice wanting to go home.
I give myself very good advice, but I very seldom follow it.
The rest of the characters are enjoyably crazy and provide some really funny moments. The voice actors also do a great job of bringing them to life, especially Ed Wynn as the Mad Hatter.
Mustard, yes, but mustard? Don't let's be silly.
Overall, it's a fun, chaotic, and enjoyably surreal experience. I actually have seen Tim Burton's version of Alice, and while it does have some nice visuals and great acting performances, I find that it doesn't have the same playful charm as the Disney version. I haven't seen the sequel, Through the Looking Glass, and I don't plan on watching it because I hear it's pretty bad. With the original Alice, though, I'll always love exploring its crazy and imaginative world. 8 out of 10. Up next is Peter Pan from 1953. Like Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan was being developed ever since Snow White came out, but wouldn't be finished until the early 50s. Although there have been many cinematic adaptations of J.M. Barrie's story, I find the Disney version to be the most memorable. By this point, all of Disney's animators were at the top of their game, and as a result, Peter Pan has some fantastic animation. Not only is the character animation well done, but the backgrounds do an amazing job of creating a whimsical atmosphere for Neverland. It's also full of really likable characters, with my personal favorites being Captain Hook and Smee. They provide some of the movie's funniest moments with Hook's short temper and Smee's naivete.
The poor captain has a splitting headache. We mustn't annoy him.
Tinkerbell is also memorable, which isn't surprising because she is one of Disney's most iconic characters, although I'm always surprised by how mean she is towards Wendy. Unfortunately though, this is another Disney movie that hasn't aged well in terms of cultural depictions, specifically the Native Americans. Their offensive characterization really makes their scenes uncomfortable to watch, even if this movie came out in the early 50s. It's especially disappointing since they have one of the most memorable songs in the movie.
Why does he ask you? Once the engine didn't know all the things that he knows now, but the engine he sure learned a lot, and it's all from asking how.
Outside of that though, Peter Pan is a classic movie that has aged pretty well for the most part. It gets a 7 out of 10. And no, I haven't seen that awful looking Peter Pan and Wendy, and I probably never will. Disney's next animated feature was Lady and the Tramp from 1955. This movie has 3 big firsts for Disney. It was their first animated film to be a completely original story, their first that they distributed themselves instead of through RKO, and their first to be made in a then new invention called CinemaScope, which we know today as widescreen. The last one is important because it really enhances the movie's visuals. The animation in Lady and the Tramp is truly breathtaking. Not only is the character animation as good as ever, but it also features some gorgeous backdrops by Disney artist Ivan Earl. They do a great job of immersing us in the film's turn-of-the-century American town, not unlike Walt's own hometown of Marceline, Missouri that he remembered so fondly. As for the story and characters, while they're not quite as strong as the visuals, they're still pretty enjoyable. The story moves somewhat slow, but that sort of adds to the charm as we're able to take in the overall atmosphere and get to know the characters. The titular Lady and the Tramp make for a surprisingly effective couple where, unlike most Disney protagonists, their love slowly blossoms rather than it happening immediately. You also can't help but feel sorry for Lady as she adjusts to her owner's new baby and her Aunt Sarah. Seriously, Aunt Sarah can go to hell.
Oh, good gracious, what are you doing here? Go on now, shoot, scat, get out of here. Oh, there.
And of course, we can't forget about the iconic spaghetti scene, which Walt surprisingly almost cut from the film before animator Frank Thomas convinced him to keep it. And it's good that he did, as it's a really cute moment. Another highlight for me is the climactic fight between Tramp and the rat. For a movie that's mostly pretty tame, this scene is surprisingly intense, made even more dramatic by the dark colors and lighting. But sadly, this is yet another Disney movie that has some offensive stereotypes, which in this case are the Siamese cats. It doesn't help that, unlike the crows from Dumbo and the natives from Peter Pan, they're portrayed as villainous. And no one ever talks about that one Mexican dog, but he's almost if not just as offensive as the cats.
And my sister, Rosita Chiquita Juanita Chihuahua, I think.
But overall, outside of a somewhat slow pace and some characters that haven't aged well, Lady and the Tramp is another Disney classic with gorgeous visuals and likable main characters, which is why I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. And no, I haven't seen the remake and have no interest in doing so. Now we get to Sleeping Beauty from 1959, the first Disney princess movie since Cinderella. Kind of fitting that Disney both started and ended the 50s with princess movies. Anyways, Sleeping Beauty was actually in development for several years and was one of the most expensive animated films Disney produced at the time. Because of this, the movie initially failed to make its money back, and wouldn't turn a profit until its various re-releases years later. Since then, it's been regarded as a Disney classic, as it should. The best part of Sleeping Beauty has to be its animation. The visuals are absolutely gorgeous, complete with bright, vibrant colors and amazing backgrounds, once again by Ivan Earl. The movie also once again uses CinemaScope, which helps give the movie a big, epic feel. These elements, combined with the fluid character animation, make Sleeping Beauty one of Disney's best-looking animated movies. The story and characters aren't quite as strong, but are still enjoyable overall. The main characters, Princess Aurora and Prince Philip, are more developed and interesting than the main characters in Snow White and Cinderella, but they still come off as somewhat bland and boring by today's standards. In fact, I don't think they even have any dialogue in the entire second half. The side characters, like the 2 kings and the 3 fairies, also have some fun moments.
It looks awful. That's because it's on you, dear.
But of course, we all know who the real show stealer is. Maleficent. While she isn't particularly complex or has an interesting motivation, the whole reason she's evil is because she wasn't invited to a party, her menacing demeanor and beautiful character design by Mark Davis make her one of the most memorable Disney villains of all time. In fact, one of the best sequences of the movie is her climactic fight with Philip in which she turns into a dragon. Another highlight is the music, most of which was adapted from Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty ballet. Not only does it provide some memorable songs like Once Upon a Dream, but the score helps enhance the movie's epic scope.
I know you, I walked with you once upon a dream.
Sleeping Beauty is the best Disney film so far since Alice in Wonderland, and a movie I always love returning to. It easily deserves an 8 out of 10. And I know I probably sound like a broken record, but no, I haven't seen the Maleficent movies and will never willingly do so. After Sleeping Beauty was a box office flop, Walt wanted to find a way to produce animated films more cheaply. So his old partner Ub Iwerks invented something called the Xerox process. This used the then recent photocopying technology to color in the animator's drawings, rather than using ink and paint like before. The first movie to make use of this new process was 101 Dalmatians from 1961. This idea worked as the movie was much cheaper to make than Sleeping Beauty and was more successful at the box office. Unfortunately though, the xerography process also had its downsides. The process gave the animation a much rougher and sketchier look than before, which some people, including Walt himself, found to be disappointing. Sadly, I kind of agree. I know some people really like the sketchy style of Disney animation from the 60s and 70s, but I've never been a huge fan. To me, it just makes the animation look unfinished. That's not to say the animation in Dalmatians is bad, though. Despite me not being a fan of the art style, the characters are still well animated, and the backgrounds have a unique look to them, giving an interesting look at early 60s London. The movie also has some likable characters, but for me the highlight has to be Cruella de Vil. From her manic personality to her great character design, once again by Mark Davis, Cruella is definitely one of the most memorable Disney villains.
Anita, darling, how are you? Miserable, darling, as usual, perfectly wretched.
Outside of her, though, I'd say this movie is fine. It doesn't stand out quite as much as Disney's other movies, but it still tells a cute story with some funny and even heartwarming moments. The story isn't particularly complex as it's just about some puppies getting kidnapped, but it's still pretty fun on its own. It's also interesting to see Disney animate some newer pieces of technology for the first time, like television. Over the years, Dalmatians has actually become a pretty big franchise, being spun off into TV shows, direct-to-video sequels, and even some live-action remakes. I'm not quite as familiar with these pieces of media, but as for the original 101 Dalmatians, it's a perfectly fine, albeit a bit forgettable experience. 6 out of 10. Up next is The Sword and the Stone from 1963, and like the last movie, it's nothing too special. Based on the legend of King Arthur, the film follows a young Arthur, nicknamed Ward, as he studies under the wizard Merlin. And that's basically the whole plot of the movie. Not much happens outside of that. This is one of the biggest problems with the movie. Because it has such a slow pace, it's easy to get a little bored watching it. The main character Ward also doesn't have much development or personality. Also, he has 3 voice actors throughout the movie because the first 2 hit puberty or their voices got too deep. Ward's constantly changing voice can surprisingly get a little distracting.
Oh, my name's Arthur, but everyone calls me Ward.
He was a monster, the biggest fish I ever saw.
That being said though, there are some more memorable characters, especially Merlin. He has the perfect mixture of eccentricity and wisdom, which makes him a really fun character. His sidekick, the owl Archimedes, is also kind of fun with his grumpy personality, which often clashes with Merlin's more upbeat demeanor.
He should be here in, I'd say half an hour. Who? I'd like to know who.
There's also this running joke where Merlin keeps mentioning things from modern times because he can see into the future. While this can make the movie feel a bit dated, it's still pretty funny.
Why, they might even make a motion picture about you. Motion picture? Oh. That's something like television. Without commercials.
The animation keeps the sketchy style of 101 Dalmatians, and like before, I'm still not a huge fan of it, but the character animation and backgrounds are still nice. Probably the most memorable sequence is the magic fight between Merlin and Madame Mim. The animators must have had a lot of fun coming up with different creatures for the characters to turn themselves into, and they managed to keep their defining features as they transform.
Now, Mim, no dragons, remember?
Did I say no purple dragons?
The Sword and the Stone was also the first animated Disney film to feature songs by the Sherman Brothers, the legendary songwriting team behind Mary Poppins, Winnie the Pooh, It's a Small World, and many more. Sadly though, they didn't leave the best first impression, as the songs aren't nearly as memorable as their other.
Pockety, pockety, wackety, whack. Abber, abber, and abber, and ack. Shrink in size, very small. We got to save enough room for all.
Overall, The Sword and the Stone can be pretty forgettable with its bland main characters, slow pace, and unremarkable songs. But its great character animation and memorable side characters are just enough for me to call this an above-average movie. Or more specifically, a 6 out of 10. By the early 60s, Walt Disney wasn't nearly as involved in the making of his studio's animated films as he was in the early days. He was still involved to a certain extent, but had mostly shifted his focus on live-action films, TV shows, and theme parks like Disneyland and what would become Walt Disney World. However, after The Sword in the Stone proved to be a critical and commercial disappointment, Walt decided that for the studio's next film, The Jungle Book, he would once again have to step in personally. This included firing the original writer, Bill Peet, who had also written 101 Dalmatians and The Sword in the Stone. Peet wanted the story to be darker, like Rudyard Kipling's original book, whereas Walt wanted to make a more lighthearted movie. Of course, Walt's vision won out, and it seems his instincts were correct, as The Jungle Book became a huge success. Unfortunately, it was also the last animated film Walt personally oversaw. He died less than a year before its release. It was later said that had The Jungle Book not been successful, the animation studio probably would have shut down, since the animators wouldn't have had enough confidence to go on without Walt. In that sense, The Jungle Book basically saved Disney animation. While I don't consider The Jungle Book to be one of Disney's best movies, it's thankfully much more memorable than the last movie. This film was full of likable characters like Bagheera the Panther, King Louie, and of course Baloo. The latter is especially memorable with his laid-back personality and a nice voice performance by Phil Harris.
I'll tear 'em limb from limb. I'll beat 'em out. Yeah. Well, man, what a beat.
The main character, Mowgli, doesn't really have much personality, but it's easy to sympathize with him not wanting to leave the jungle. The songs, once again written by the Sherman Brothers, are another highlight, and are much more memorable than their songs in The Sword and the Stone. However, my favorite song is probably the only one they didn't write, The Bare Necessities.
Look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities. Forget about your worries and your strife.
Like a lot of Disney movies from this era, The Jungle Book is pretty light in its story, since it's mostly about Mowgli meeting a bunch of different characters in the jungle. While this can cause the story to slow down quite a bit, it's not a huge deal as, once again, the characters are still likable. The backgrounds are also really well done, greatly highlighting the tropical atmosphere of the jungle. I have seen the live-action remake of The Jungle Book from 2016, and honestly, it's probably the only one of these remakes that I think is a bit better than the original. The visuals are stunning, and it has a more engaging story. But as for the original Jungle Book, it's a pretty fun movie overall. While it has a bit of a slow pace and a somewhat weak main character, the movie makes up for it with great animation, likable side characters, and some memorable songs. But the ending kinda sucks. 6 out of 10. While The Jungle Book helped save Disney animation, its success was bittersweet. The death of Walt Disney in 1966 started what is often referred to as Disney's Dark Age. Many at the company felt lost without Walt guiding them, often making decisions based on the question, what would Walt have done? As a result, many of Disney's movies from this era ended up feeling behind the times, and as the 70s and 80s wore on, the company would slowly lose more and more money. The what would Walt have done mentality was especially strong with the studio's next animated film, The Aristocats, mainly because it was the last animated movie Walt greenlit before his death. Unfortunately, that's about the most interesting aspect of this movie. The Aristocats, while not necessarily bad, is one of the most bland and forgettable movies Disney has put out. There isn't even much conflict, as the whole story is about the cat Duchess and her kittens trying to get home to their owner, along with the help of Thomas O'Malley, once again voiced by Phil Harris. This wouldn't be much of a problem if the characters were, interesting, but they just don't have much that makes them interesting or memorable. The butler Edgar is a good example, as he barely poses as a threat, even though he's the one who tries to get rid of the cats. He also has pretty weak motivation, as he's only after the inheritance of the cat's owner. If Edgar counts as a villain, he's probably the lamest Disney villain of all time.
Cats inherit first, and I come after the cats. Me after... No, it's not fair.
The rest of the characters can be enjoyable and have some funny moments, including the dogs Napoleon and Lafayette, but they don't really serve much of a purpose to the story. Some characters could even be problematic, including the Chinese cat, played rather uncomfortably by Paul Winchell, essentially doing his Tigger voice but with a stereotypical Asian accent.
Shanghai, Hong Kong, Fuyang. Fortune cookie, always wrong. Not the hot one.
I get that this movie is over 50 years old, but even by then I feel like we knew better than to have racist depictions like this. There is no excuse for it. The songs are also mostly forgettable, except for Everybody Wants to Be a Cat, which is a total bop. One bright spot in the movie is the animation. While I'm still not a fan of the sketchy style produced by the Xerox process, the characters are still well designed and animated, and the backgrounds give a very romantic look at Paris in 1910. Like I said, there are also some funny moments here and there, but they're not enough to really hold my attention for the whole movie. The story does pick up its pace a little during the climax, but even that is pretty forgettable by Disney standards. And that's honestly the best way to sum up the Aristocats. It's not a bad movie, it's just forgettable, and I'm giving it a 5 out of 10. Up next is Robin Hood from 1973. This movie's noteworthy as the first animated Disney film made entirely without Walt's input. It must have been a daunting task for the animators to make a movie without their innovative leader guiding them. But thankfully, while Robin Hood isn't one of Disney's best movies, it's still a fun adventure. Of course, this is a spin on the classic medieval folktale where all the characters are anthropomorphic animals. This makes Robin Hood the first Disney movie without any humans. There were humans in Bambi, they just didn't appear on screen. Admittedly, there isn't really much of a point in making them all animals, but it does lead to some creative visual gags. The story, like many Disney films from this era, is pretty slow-paced, but the movie makes up for it with some likable characters. The titular Robin Hood is a pretty strong lead with the clever way he gets past the law, while helping the people of Nottingham at the same time. His love interest, Maid Marian, doesn't have much of a personality or enough screen time, but she does have a pretty cute relationship with Robin Hood. Robin's sidekick Little John, voiced yet again by Phil Harris, is similarly not very complex, but forms a good team with Robin Hood.
Rob? That's a naughty word. We never rob. We just sort of borrow a bit from those who can afford it. Borrow? Boy, are we in debt.
But my favorite character has to be the villain, Prince John. While he's not a particularly threatening villain, his ego and short temper provide some of the funniest moments in the movie, made even better by Peter Ustinov's great voice performance.
Yeah, Mother. Mother always did like Richard best.
The Sheriff of Nottingham is another lovably cruel character with how he cheats the villagers out of their money.
Oh boy, 1 whole farthing!
One of the weaker spots in the movie is the animation. While the characters and backgrounds are well drawn, there are quite a few moments where you can tell that the movie is recycling animation either from itself or other Disney movies. This was a common practice for Disney that was meant to save time and money, but it's especially noticeable here. In fact, the phony King of England sequence is infamous for being almost entirely made up of animation from other movies like Snow White, The Jungle Book, and the Aristocats. However, one area the animation excels in is the action sequences. They're surprisingly well choreographed and provide some intense moments, especially in the climax.
Shoot him!
So overall, Robin Hood is one of the better movies from Disney's Dark Age, despite its slow pace and animation that, while not bad, definitely isn't Disney's best. 6 out of 10. The next movie is one that I have a lot of fond memories of, The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Although it was released in 1977, this movie is actually made up of 3 previously released shorts. The first is Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree, released in 1966 and was unfortunately the last animated project from Disney released in Walt's lifetime. The others are Winnie the Pooh and the Blustery Day from 1968, and Winnie the Pooh and Tigger 2 from 1974. All 3 are really fun shorts with a laid-back atmosphere and lovable characters. Much like Snow White and Fun and Fancy Free, Winnie the Pooh was a huge part of my childhood. I used to watch these shorts all the time as a kid, especially Blustery Day, so it's hard for me to be objective about them. Pooh and all the other characters are always fun to return to. They have such fun and memorable personalities that it's hard to dislike them. Seriously, Pooh is one of the most lovable and pure characters Disney ever made, and if you disagree, you have no soul. The only character I'm not a huge fan of is the Gopher from Honey Tree, partially because he's basically the same as the Beaver from Lady and the Tramp, but also because his voice can get pretty grating. He was originally created to replace Piglet, but once that character became part of the shorts, he was thankfully phased out.
I'm gonna skedaddle. I'm not in the book. And have a ding-dang plan of it.
The story doesn't follow the typical 3-act structure, instead feeling more like a series of short stories. But in my opinion, that only adds to the casual, childlike tone of the film, allowing us to get more absorbed in the atmosphere and appreciate the characters. Another one of the best aspects of this movie is the animation. I've said before how I'm not a fan of the sketchy animation style produced by the xerography process, but I think that style actually fits really well for Pooh. Because the shorts are set inside books like the ones the shorts were based on, the sketchy art style helps add to the storybook feel. This is especially apparent with the beautiful backgrounds, which perfectly capture the childlike, whimsical atmosphere of the 100-Acre Wood. And of course, you can't forget about the iconic songs, once again written by the Sherman Brothers. These songs, especially the ones in Blustery Day, are some of the best and most memorable that the pair wrote for Disney, including the main theme and the wonderful thing about Tigers.
The wonderful thing about Tigers is Tigers are wonderful things. Their tops are made out of rubber, their bottoms are made out of springs. They're bouncy, trouncy, flouncy, pouncy, fun, 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 fun. But the most wonderful thing about Tigers is I'm the only one. I'm the only one.
This movie is like being wrapped up in a warm blanket. Its laid-back tone and nostalgic value it has for me makes it one of my biggest comfort movies. Again, I may be biased, but The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh will always have a special place in my heart. It definitely deserves an 8 out of 10. Our next movie is The Rescuers, produced the same year as Winnie the Pooh. By the late 70s, many of the animators who had worked under Walt were either retired or about to retire, so new, younger animators were brought in to one day take their place. The Rescuers was one of the first movies where the new animators could really show off their talents. Probably the most noteworthy example is Don Bluth, one of the directing animators. His distinct style can be seen at many points in the movie. Unfortunately, though, that's about the most interesting aspect of The Rescuers. I know many people have fond memories of this movie, and I wouldn't want to take that away from them, but I've personally never been a huge fan. My biggest problem is that, for an adventure movie, the pace is really slow. Having a slow pace isn't always an issue, but for a movie about rescuing a little girl, I'd expect this to be a bit more exciting.
Wait a minute. She might catch us in her swampmobile.
We'll swipe it. I've always wanted to drive it.
The characters don't really have much to remember them by. The protagonists, Bernard and Bianca, develop a pretty cute romance, but they don't have much personality to them. The side characters, like Orville the Albatross, have some funny moments but aren't the most memorable Disney sidekicks. Probably the least interesting character, though, is the little girl Penny, since she has no interesting qualities or personality outside of being, well, a little girl. Also, I don't think the movie ever explains how Penny can talk to animals. That just seems like an important detail to leave out. The one character I really enjoy is the villain, Madame Medusa. Even though she's basically Cruella 2.0, she still has a lovably evil personality, made even better with some great character animation by Milt Kahl. And fun fact, this was actually the last movie Kahl worked on before retiring.
She won't take orders.
You are too soft.
Another aspect that doesn't really work is the music. Not only are the songs really forgettable, but most of them have that 70s sound to them, which ends up making the movie feel more dated. One bright spot, however, is the animation. I already mentioned how the newer animators got to show off their talents here, but they also made some improvements to the xerography process, giving the animation a softer and less sketchy look. It still isn't perfect, especially when the characters sometimes stand out too much from the backgrounds, but it's definitely a step up from the last few movies. So overall, while The Rescuers has some good stuff in it, it's mostly a pretty bland and forgettable experience. But still, it does represent an interesting time in Disney history. 5 out of 10. Thankfully, our next movie is much more memorable. The Fox and the Hound from 1981. I think pretty much everyone has at least one animated Disney movie that they find to be super underrated. And for me, it's probably this one. The Fox and the Hound got decent reviews and did okay at the box office when it came out, but I think it deserved much better. It tells a surprisingly dark and mature story with some great animation. I mentioned in my Rescuers review how the newer Disney animators were beginning to take over, but in The Fox and the Hound, that transition was even more apparent. Unfortunately, the production was complicated by creative differences among the animators, and especially the departure of Don Bluth, who was dissatisfied with the movies the studio was making at the time, to start his own studio along with several other animators. Thankfully, though, the film still turned out great. In fact, this is probably my favorite movie from Disney's Dark Age. Like I said, the movie has a surprisingly poignant story in which a fox named Todd and a hunting dog named Copper become friends, only to discover that they're meant to be enemies. As they get older, the pair eventually do become enemies, but are finally able to overcome their prejudices and respect each other again. The theme of fighting prejudice was rare for Disney movies at the time, but it works really well here. In addition, the story doesn't shy away from showing some really dark and intense moments which help heighten the tension in the story. There's also some real tearjerker scenes, especially when Widow Tweet has to release Todd into the wild.
But in my heart's the memory, and there will always be.
But one area where I think the writers chickened out was when Chief, Copper's mentor, gets hit by a train, causing Copper to swear vengeance against Todd, who was partially responsible for it. While Chief survives in this story, the younger animators felt Chief should have died, and honestly, I agree. I think it would have made the scene more impactful and give Copper more of a reason to hate Todd for it.
Todd, if it's the last thing I do, I'll get you for this.
Outside of that though, the story is really well written. Besides Todd and Copper, the movie is full of likable characters like Big Mama, Vixie, and Widow Tweed. The only characters I'm not super fond of are Dinky and Boomer.
Okay, Boomer.
Who are mostly just there for comic relief and don't add much to the story. Another highlight though is the animation. The movie furthers the advancements made to the xerography process even more than The Rescuers by having softer and less sketchy animation. The backgrounds also do a good job of immersing the viewer in the countryside setting. But where the animation shines the most in my opinion is the climactic bear fight, animated by Glenn Keane. It's easily the most intense and engaging part of the film, and gets surprisingly violent for a Disney movie. The Fox and the Hound is truly a Disney classic, with great animation, likable characters, and a dark and mature story, which is why I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. Up next is The Black Cauldron from 1985, and honestly, the history of this film's production is probably more interesting than the movie itself. Disney purchased the rights to the Chronicles of Prydain book series all the way back in 1971. Afterwards, the movie spent over a decade in development hell before production finally began in earnest after The Fox and the Hound. But just as the movie was wrapping up in 1984, a major shakeup at the Walt Disney Company occurred. For years, the company had slowly been losing money to the point where it came close to being bought up and broken into several different companies. But in 1984, former Paramount head Michael Eisner stepped in as Disney's new CEO, while Frank Wells of Warner Brothers became its president. Afterwards, Eisner brought in a friend of his from Paramount named Jeffrey Katzenberg to run the company's movie division, where one of his first tasks was looking over the nearly completed Black Cauldron. Katzenberg was horrified by the movie's dark tone, feeling that it was too scary and violent for families, and ordered several sequences to be cut. In the end, The Black Cauldron was a critical and commercial flop, even making less money than the Caribous movie, which came out the same year. Needless to say, this movie is widely considered to be the black sheep of the Disney family. With all that in mind, does this movie really deserve to have such an infamous reputation? Kind of, but not really. The Black Cauldron isn't Disney's worst movie, but in my opinion it's far from one of their best. The fact that it's a dark fantasy film similar to Lord of the Rings is intriguing, as Disney hadn't really made that kind of movie before, but the execution definitely could have been better. The biggest problem is that the movie borrows too heavily from better fantasy films without doing anything to make itself stand out. The main characters Taran and Eilonwy aren't really interesting at all, with Taran being the stereotypical every man who dreams of being a hero, and Eilonwy not having much of a personality besides being a girl. Their sidekick Gurgi is also pretty annoying, especially with his voice which sounds like the love child of Gollum and Donald Duck.
Oh, poor miserable Gurgi deserves fierce smackings and whackings on his poor tender head.
One character that does stand out to me though is the villain, the Horned King. While he's not a super interesting character, his creepy design and great voice performance by John Hurt make him one of the most underrated Disney villains.
Kill!
Another bright spot, and probably the best aspect of the film, is the animation. This was the first animated Disney film since Sleeping Beauty to be made in widescreen, which helps give the movie a grand, epic look. The backgrounds are also really cool to look at, even if, once again, they look like a lot of other fantasy worlds. Overall, The Black Cauldron is definitely a mixed bag. I appreciate that Disney wanted to try something different with this film. I just wish the story and characters were more interesting. 5 out of 10. After the disastrous results of The Black Cauldron, Jeffrey Katzenberg and the other Disney heads knew that the animation studio would have to go through some big changes. This included moving the artists into a new building and producing multiple movies at once rather than one at a time. Now, instead of every animated Disney film coming out every 3 or 4 years, they would be released every single year. The first result of this change was The Great Mouse Detective, released in 1986. Thankfully, the movie did much better than The Black Cauldron, and that it actually made a profit, though it paled in comparison to Don Bluth's An American Tail, which came out the same year. While not one of my favorite Disney movies, I still find The Great Mouse Detective to be a really fun adventure. The two best aspects are probably the protagonist, Basil of Baker Street, and the antagonist, Ratigan. While Basil is pretty eccentric and can be self-centered at times, he's still a brilliant detective and cares about the other characters like Dr. Dawson and Olivia.
Young lady, you are most definitely not accompanying us.
And that is final.
Ratigan is also an extremely fun villain who seems to revel in being evil. Not only is he funny, but he also poses as a legitimate threat. He's made even better by his expressive animation and a fantastic voice performance by Vincent Price.
Oh, I love it when I'm nasty.
The other characters, like the aforementioned Dawson and Olivia, aren't quite as memorable or engaging, but are still likable overall. The animation isn't necessarily Disney's best, but it definitely has its moments. The backgrounds help create an interesting world for the animal characters underneath Victorian-era London. But the standout sequence in the film is probably the climactic fight between Basil and Ratigan at Big Ben. Not only is the fight really intense, but it also marks the first time that an animated Disney movie used computer effects, which were used to animate the cogs in Big Ben. While this movie isn't really a musical, there are a few songs written by legendary composer Henry Mancini. The songs don't stand out as much as in other Disney movies, but still help liven up the film. The Great Mouse Detective, while not a perfect movie, is definitely a step up from the last film with some likable characters and good animation. 7 out of 10. The next movie in Disney's Dark Age is Oliver and Company from 1988. This film was actually pretty popular when it first came out, making much more money than Disney's last few movies. In fact, this film, along with Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which came out the same year, sparked a new interest in Disney animation that would only grow over the next several years. In recent years, though, this film isn't as well remembered as Disney's other films, and upon rewatching it, I can kind of see why. Oliver and Company is a pretty fun kids movie, but isn't particularly memorable beyond that. Based on Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, the film follows a kitten in New York City named Oliver who befriends a group of stray dogs, but later gets adopted by a little girl named Jenny. For me, the most interesting part of the movie is probably the animation. This was the first Disney movie to be set in modern-day New York City. It's interesting to see the technology and fashion of the 80s in an animated Disney film. The backgrounds return to the sketchier style of previous Disney movies, but here it helps illustrate the film's urban setting. The animators also continued experimenting with computer animation, which is even more prominent here than in The Great Mouse Detective. While the computer animation stands out sometimes, for the most part it blends in really well with the rest of the visuals. As for the story and characters, like I said, they're not particularly memorable. Oliver and Jenny don't have much personality to them, although they do have some pretty heartwarming moments together.
We'll always be good company, you and me. Just wait and see.
The villain, Sykes, doesn't really have enough screen time, but still has an intimidating presence. Not to mention that he has one of the most brutal Disney villain deaths. While the characters aren't super complex, their voice actors help give them some personality, especially Billy Joel as Dodger, Cheech Marin as Tito, Dom DeLuise as Fagin, and Bette Midler as Georgette. There are also several songs in the movie, which makes it the first Disney animated film in a while that's a true musical. However, most of the songs end up feeling dated due to many of them having an 80s pop sound. Although Why Should I Worry is a total bop.
Why should I worry? Why should I care? I may not have a dime, but I got grease out my pants.
So while Oliver and Company isn't super memorable, it does have some positive qualities, which is why I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. The 70s and 80s were a rough time for Disney. The company struggled to find an identity after the death of Walt, resulting in movies that were usually decent but still made very little money. But after the arrival of Michael Eisner, Frank Wells, and Jeffrey Katzenberg in 1984, things finally started looking up, and Disney released hit movies like Splash, Oliver and Company, and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. This success would pave the way for what is widely known as the Disney Renaissance. This was a period of unprecedented growth and success throughout the Walt Disney Company, including the animation studio. There's some debate over which movie started Disney Animation's renaissance. Some say it was Oliver and Company, some say Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and others even claim it started with The Great Mouse Detective. But most Disney fans, including myself, agree that the movie that truly kick-started the Disney Renaissance was The Little Mermaid. It's hard to overstate how huge of an impact this movie had on Disney. Based on the story by Hans Christian Andersen, The Little Mermaid was Disney's first fairy tale movie since Sleeping Beauty 30 years earlier. When writer-directors Ron Clements and John Musker pitched the idea to Disney, it was seen as a big gamble at the time, but it ended up paying off. The Little Mermaid was Disney's biggest critical and commercial success in decades. When looking at the movie, it's easy to see why it's become so iconic and beloved. The Little Mermaid has everything you could want from a Disney movie, including beautiful animation, unforgettable songs, and a well-paced story. Let's start with the latter. This movie is a brilliant return of the Disney fairy tale genre, putting a fresh spin on the formula that makes it really engaging to watch. The main character, Ariel, has been criticized by many in recent years for disobeying her father and not learning her lesson in the end. Personally, I don't really agree with this sentiment. Ariel set out a clear goal and was able to achieve it. In fact, when this movie was first released, many critics praised Ariel for not being like the other princesses who just sat around and waited for her prince to come and rescue them. She actually makes her dreams come true and even saves Prince Eric on a couple occasions. I do think it sends a weird message to girls by having Ariel run away to a guy she just met, but to be fair, this is a problem with a lot of older Disney movies. The rest of the characters are similarly well written, including Sebastian. While he can be very strict with Ariel, it's obvious that he also cares deeply about her.
If we could get that witch to give you back your voice, you could go home with all the normal fish and just be miserable for the rest of your life.
The same can be said about her father, King Triton, though I wish the movie would have elaborated on why he hates humans and wants Ariel to stay away from them. One of my favorite characters is Ursula, who has to be one of the most memorable Disney villains. Like Ratigan from The Great Mouse Detective, she seems to revel in being evil, and poses as a genuine threat.
King Triton's headstrong, lovesick girl would make a charming addition to my little garden.
As I said earlier, the animation is also fantastic. This was actually the last Disney movie to use cell animation, and they really went out on a high note. The characters are extremely well animated, especially Glenn Keane's work on Ariel, and the vivid colors and gorgeous backgrounds bring so much life to both the land and the ocean. There's also some great effects animation, especially with Ursula's magic. Do I even have to say how great the songs are? I know them, you know them, they're some of the best songs in any Disney movie. This was the first time Disney worked with Howard Ashman and Alan Menken, and they left a great first impression by crafting songs that are not only entertaining, but also add to the story. Of course, the Oscar-winning Under the Sea is a standout track, but my favorite song has to be Part of Your World, which was surprisingly almost cut from the film since Katzenberg thought it was too boring for children. Thankfully, Glenn Keane convinced him to keep it in.
Up where they walk, up where they run, up where they stay all day in the sun, wandering free. Wish I could be part of that world.
It's certainly better than whatever the hell this is.
Remember the swamp? Remember my song in the swamp when I was like...
I should also commend Alan Menken for his work on the score. He did an amazing job, especially since this was his first time scoring a movie. The Little Mermaid definitely deserves to be called a Disney classic, which is why I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. The next movie in the Disney Renaissance is also the one that's probably the least well known, The Rescuers Down Under. This marked the first time Disney made a direct sequel to one of their animated films, and unfortunately, it didn't really work out for them. After the film made little money during its opening weekend, Jeffrey Katzenberg decided to pull the movie's TV ads, essentially ruining its chance of success. And that's a real shame, because while it's not the best movie from the Disney Renaissance, The Rescuers Down Under is a huge improvement over its predecessor. I made it clear that I'm not a huge fan of the original Rescuers. While it has some good stuff in it, I mostly find it to be a bland and boring experience with uninteresting characters and forgettable music. The sequel, on the other hand, is a much more exciting adventure, complete with beautiful animation and some surprisingly intense action scenes. The story even has some higher stakes than the first one, in which Bernard and Bianca have to save an Australian boy named Cody from a poacher named Percival McLeach. The latter is an extremely intimidating and memorable villain who isn't afraid of doing anything to get what he wants, even endangering Cody, on top of George C. Scott delivering a great voice performance.
That's no secret, boy. You see, I already got the father.
As for Bernard and Bianca, they're sadly still pretty bland and uninteresting, as is Cody. There is, however, a subplot involving Bernard trying to propose to Bianca, and it's easy to sympathize with him as his proposal keeps getting interrupted. Another memorable character is Wilbur, who basically replaces Orville from the previous movie. Get it? Orville and Wilbur? Haha. He has a fun, energetic personality that's made even better by some hilarious voice acting by John Candy.
Speaking of which, what can I get you? How about a nice mango Maui cooler? Very, very nice. Very tasty, you know.
No, thank you.
Or, what else do I got? Oh, the coconut guava nectar. It's carbonated. Very nice. I got little umbrellas for each one of them and a little coconut thing.
The animation in Rescuers Down Under was truly revolutionary for its time, and that it was the first to use the CAP system. This was an animation software developed by a small studio which had been experimenting with computer animation called Pixar. Basically, the animation would still be done with papers and pencils like before, but rather than using regular ink and paint or the xerography process, the drawings would be scanned on a computer. The CAP system would then color the drawings digitally, giving the animation a much more colorful and vibrant look and greatly enhancing the visuals of this movie. As I said before, the animation also provides some memorable action scenes which can get surprisingly fast-paced and intense. These scenes are made even better by Bruce Broughton's beautiful music score, which perfectly captures the adventurous tone the movie was going for. Overall, The Rescuers Down Under isn't a perfect movie, but it's still a big improvement over its predecessor with beautiful animation, intense action, some likable characters, and some great music. 7 out of 10. But as good as The Rescuers Down Under is, it doesn't even come close to the movie that came out just 1 year later. Beauty and the Beast. Where do I even begin with this one? I mean, Beauty and the Beast is one of the most widely acclaimed movies in Disney history. In fact, it was the first animated film to get an Oscar nomination for Best Picture. And honestly, it deserved that and more. Beauty and the Beast is an absolute masterpiece that I never get tired of. Let's start with one of the movie's best aspects, the story. The movie, of course, follows a prince who was turned into a beast by a sorceress. To break the spell, he must fall in love, and finally gets his chance when a girl named Belle becomes a prisoner in his castle. Belle and the Beast have an incredibly organic and believable relationship. Unlike the Disney couples that came before them, they take time to develop their feelings for each other instead of immediately falling in love. In fact, they actually hate each other at first, but gradually change their minds.
By the way, thank you for saving my life.
You're welcome.
The movie smartly leaves it ambiguous how long this process takes. It could have been days, weeks, or even months. This helps the story flow much more naturally than if they fell in love right away. While the characters' romance is incredibly well written, they also work really well individually. Belle is one of the most complex and interesting heroines in Disney history. She doesn't go along with what the rest of her village expects of her, instead spending most of her time reading. As for the Beast, he's similarly complex with how he seems to be a terrifying menace, but really just wants someone who loves him. This also provides the movie with a great message about not judging people based on their appearances. There's also the meme dispenser himself, Gaston, who has to be one of the most memorable and well-written Disney villains. He starts off as comically brash and egotistical, but as Belle keeps rejecting him, he turns to more drastic measures and becomes much more threatening by the end. He also turns the typical hero archetype on its head with how everyone in the village loves him despite how much of a jerk he is.
Belle, it's about time you got your head out of those books and paid attention to more important things. Like me.
The rest of the characters, like Lumiere, Cogsworth, and Mrs. Potts, are also very lovable, even if they're not quite as complex as the others. Of course, the animation is also spectacular. Disney continued to take full advantage of the CAP system, which gives the movie a wide variety of colors and amazing computer effects, especially in the iconic ballroom dance scene. The character animation is similarly astounding, most notably Glenn Keane's work on The Beast. Once again, Disney brought in Howard Ashman and Alan Menken to do the music, and like in The Little Mermaid, the songs greatly enhanced the movie. My favorites would have to be either Be Our Guest or the song Beauty and the Beast, though really all the songs are excellent.
Tale as old as time, song as old as rhyme, Beauty and the Beast.
I honestly can't think of any major flaws with this movie, or at least any that are worth mentioning. It's just amazing all around. I actually have seen the live-action remake of this movie from 2017, and while I wouldn't necessarily call it a bad film, it's definitely a huge downgrade from the original. It doesn't really add enough new elements to the story to justify its existence, and the few changes they made mostly just make it worse. It doesn't help that the remake has some not so great effects, and many of the actors don't give very good performances. In the end, it's just a lesser version of a movie that was already perfect. And honestly, that's the best word to describe Beauty and the Beast. Perfect. 10 out of 10. Up next is Aladdin. After Beauty and the Beast became both a box office smash and universally adored by critics, it must have been a daunting task to follow it up. Thankfully, while Aladdin didn't get quite as good reviews as the last movie, it was even more successful financially. This was great news as the film was an uphill battle to make. It had been in development hell for several years, with Jeffrey Katzenberg constantly demanding story changes and the removal of several Howard Ashman songs, even after Howard tragically passed away from AIDS. If you haven't caught on by now, Katzenberg is known to be a petty asshole. While Aladdin isn't quite as strong as Beauty and the Beast, it is overall a Disney classic. Let's start with the titular character. Occasionally, Aladdin can be a bit grating with how the writers tried too hard to make him cool, but he's definitely likable overall. Princess Jasmine isn't particularly interesting either, but she and Aladdin do have a genuine and believable romance.
Sometimes you feel so... You're just... trapped.
Jafar is quite the memorable villain with his great design and menacing demeanor, and his sidekick Iago has some pretty funny moments. Though, like Aladdin, he can get pretty annoying.
Oh, there's a big surprise! That's an incredible... I think I'm gonna have a heart attack and die from that surprise!
But I think we all know who the real standout character is. The Genie. With his energetic and lovable personality and fantastic character animation by Eric Goldberg, he's easily the show stealer of the film. And of course, we can't forget his hilarious voice performance by the late great Robin Williams, who famously improvised many of his lines.
Rake 'em, rack 'em, rock 'em, rake, stick that sword into that snake!
You stay out of this!
Jafar, he's our man if he can't do it.
Great!
The animation is another major highlight. I already mentioned how great Eric Goldberg's work on the Genie is, but the rest of the animators also did a fantastic job, most notably Glenn Keane's animation for Aladdin. The colors and backgrounds are also gorgeous, and once again, it features some impressive computer effects. However, many have also criticized the film for giving some of the characters designs that stereotype people from the Middle East, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't see it. While I doubt the animators intended any malice with these designs, this aspect still hasn't aged well. It doesn't help that the movie has an all-white voice cast. On the plus side though, the songs here are extremely memorable, with music once again by Alan Menken and lyrics by both Howard Ashman and Tim Rice. There isn't a single forgettable song in the whole film. However, my favorite song has to be the ballad A Whole New World.
I'll chase them anywhere, there's time to spare. Let me share this whole new world with you.
Overall, while Aladdin has some flaws, it makes up for them with gorgeous animation, likable characters, and unforgettable songs. And no, I haven't seen the remake and never will, but the original gets an 8 out of 10.
Made you look.
And now, we finally get to one of my absolute favorite Disney movies, The Lion King. While nowadays it's one of Disney's most iconic and beloved films, like Simba himself, it had to go quite a few hardships to get there. The film went through several years of development hell, and many at Disney were doubtful of its success. But thankfully, The Lion King went on to become the highest-grossing animated film of its time, and was universally adored by critics. Since then, The Lion King has become one of Disney's biggest animated franchises, including countless pieces of merchandise, a large presence in the parks, and even 2 direct-to-video sequels that are surprisingly pretty decent. What? No, there wasn't a remake, I don't know what you're talking about. To be honest, I wasn't really looking forward to doing this review. It's not that I don't like The Lion King, it's actually my favorite narrative Disney film, but what can you say about it that hasn't already been said? Like I said, this is one of the most universally beloved Disney movies of all time, and for good reason. Like Beauty and the Beast, this film is nearly perfect with no major flaws. Let's start with the story, which is incredibly deep and mature by Disney standards. Loosely based on Hamlet, the story deals with the importance of taking responsibility for one's actions, especially if you're in a leadership position. The second half of the story is when these messages really shine, as the tone becomes noticeably more serious once Simba is an adult. I've always thought this represented the transition from childhood to adulthood, how the world becomes a darker and scarier place, but more fulfilling at the same time. The characters are all fantastic. Simba is an extremely likable and relatable character with how the audience can identify with his struggles. Scar is also one of the most intimidating Disney villains with how far he'll go to get what he wants. And he's one of the few that actually succeeds in his goal when he kills Simba's father, Mufasa.
Long live the king.
Speaking of which, Mufasa is another well-crafted character, which makes his death scene even more impactful. Seriously, it's one of the biggest tear-jerking scenes in any Disney film.
Dad? Dad, come on. You gotta get up. Dad.
Nala also leaves a positive impression with how much she supports Simba and develops a great romance with him. But possibly my favorite character is Rafiki, who pulls off the perfect balance of being eccentric and very wise at the same time.
Ow! Jeez, what was that for? It doesn't matter. It's in the past.
Yeah, but it still hurts.
Oh, yes, the past can hurt. But the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it.
The only characters that don't work quite as well for me are Timon and Pumbaa, since their antics can occasionally clash with the film's more serious tone. But they're still very important to the story and do have some pretty funny moments.
So we're keeping them?
Of course. Who's the brains in this outfit? My point exactly.
Another aspect that makes The Lion King stand out is its epic scope. It feels much larger and more dramatic than most other Disney films. This is not only reflected in the story, but the animation. The character animation, backgrounds, and effects are all some of Disney's best. Like Bambi, this film perfectly immerses us in its natural setting. This is evident right from the opening sequence, which immediately presents us with a gorgeous and dramatic setup for the rest of the film. And since there are no humans present, it helps the movie feel more timeless. The epic scope is also reflected in the score by the great Hans Zimmer, and once again, it's one of my favorite film scores of all time. Not only does it capture the larger-than-life tone of the film, but it makes brilliant use of African instruments and chants. The songs, by Elton John and Tim Rice, are all unforgettable and amazing in their own ways, but my favorite has to be the opening song, Circle of Life. Like I said, there isn't much to say about The Lion King that hasn't been said already. The story, animation, music, and characters are all simply amazing. There's very little to pick apart from it, and what little flaws it does have don't take away from the overall experience. The Lion King is my second favorite Disney movie behind Fantasia, and I never get tired of it. I tell you to go watch it, but let's face it, you probably already have. 10 out of 10. Up next is Pocahontas, and man, we are taking a serious step in quality. We're going from one of my favorite Disney movies, The Lion King, to what is, in my opinion, the worst movie in the Disney Renaissance and one of Disney Animation's weakest efforts in general. Interestingly though, both this film and The Lion King were in production at the same time. What's amazing is that at the time, Pocahontas was projected to be the bigger hit, while The Lion King was still seen as a little side project.
And Jeffrey calls a breakfast meeting. And in the meeting, we have the whole crew from Pocahontas and Lion King. And Jeffrey says, Pocahontas is a home run. It's West Side Story. It's Romeo and Juliet with American Indians. It's a hit. It's got hit written all over it. Lion King, on the other hand, is kind of an experiment. We don't really know if anybody's going to really want to see it. And after that meeting, absolutely no one wanted to work on Lion King.
Further proof that Hollywood executives have no idea what the hell they're talking about.
I'm surrounded by idiots.
One of the weakest aspects of Pocahontas is its story, which was obviously loosely based on the real Native American woman of the same name. But really, it's just another retelling of the forbidden love because of prejudice story we've seen over and over again in stuff like Romeo and Juliet and West Side Story. Because the plot is so cliché, it's hard to get as invested in it as the previous films. The anti-prejudice angle is also clumsily handled, as the Native Americans are shown as being wrong for wanting to fight the white people, even though they were the ones who invaded their land. I know violence isn't the only answer, but how else are they going to defend themselves? And the movie largely ignores how white colonizers will go on to completely wipe out Native American communities. What sucks about these problematic elements is that I can tell the crew were trying really hard to be respectful to Native American cultures, even hiring actual indigenous actors to play the characters. It's definitely a step up from the natives in Peter Pan, but it still hasn't aged super well. One thing I do like, however, and I guess this could count as a spoiler even though the movie is almost 30 years old, is that Pocahontas and John Smith don't stay together in the end. Instead, Pocahontas chooses to stay with her people while Smith goes back to England. This is a very mature way to end their story, and not something we often see from Disney. Another problem with the story is its confused tone. I mentioned how The Lion King suffered from a bit of tone whiplash, but here it's even worse. Most of the film seems to be going for a very serious and mature tone, which would be a refreshing change of pace for Disney. However, that tone is ruined by having a bunch of cute animal characters running around and getting into shenanigans. Even worse, the animals don't even play a big role in the story. It's like the animators just put them in there so the kids watching wouldn't get bored. I also don't really get why they don't talk. Supposedly it was to make the movie more realistic, even though there's literally a talking tree in the movie and some other magical elements.
Pocahontas, that tree is talking to me.
Then you should talk back.
The other characters are a bit more likable, but still don't leave a great impression. Pocahontas herself is kind of a bland protagonist, as is her love interest, John Smith. Governor Ratcliffe is also one of the weakest Disney villains, especially since his only motivation is that he wants gold. That's it, that's the whole reason why he wants to come to the New World and kill the Native Americans. It doesn't help that he has easily the worst song of the whole film.
See how I glitter.
I know I've been pretty negative so far, but this movie definitely had some positives. For one thing, the animation is absolutely gorgeous. The humans have a more realistic look to them, which is something Disney doesn't normally do, and it fits really well with the film's more serious tone. The backgrounds and colors do an amazing job of portraying the natural beauty of America, and are reminiscent of Ivan Earle's work on Sleeping Beauty. I mentioned how Governor Ratcliffe's song isn't very good, but the rest of the songs are thankfully much better. While they're not necessarily Alan Menken's best work, the songs are definitely some of the highlights of the film, especially Colors of the Wind.
Can you sing with all the voices of the mountain? Can you paint with all the colors of the wind? Can you paint with all the colors of the wind?
Overall, I hesitate to call Pocahontas a bad film, but it's extremely boring and forgettable and even has some problematic elements, making it easily the worst movie in the Renaissance. 5 out of 10. Disney was doing incredibly well in the 90s, but in 1994 there were two events that put a bit of a damper on things. The first was when Disney president Frank Welch tragically passed away in a helicopter crash shortly after the release of The Lion King. The film was dedicated to his memory. Shortly after the release of The Lion King, Jeffrey Katzenberg left Disney after Michael Eisner refused to give him the president position, even though it was so soon after Frank Welch died. Once again, petty asshole. By the way, after Katzenberg left, he teamed up with Steven Spielberg and David Geffen to form a little company called DreamWorks. I'm sure that won't come up again. Anyways, while these setbacks were hard, Disney's movies for the rest of the decade were still relatively well received, including our next film, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Let me tell you, after sitting through Pocahontas, this movie was definitely a palate cleanser. Hunchback is one of the best movies from the Disney Renaissance, and one of Disney's best animated films in general. It took more risks than any other Disney movie before it or arguably since, and ended up as a truly amazing film. Based on Victor Hugo's novel of the same name, Hunchback definitely toned down some of the book's darker themes, but it's still extremely dark by Disney standards, and I mean that in a good way. I'm honestly kind of shocked that this movie managed to get away with the G rating. I would have at least made it PG. It brilliantly deals with the dangers of prejudice and the effect Christianity has on society. At the same time though, it doesn't go too far with its mature themes so that it's still appropriate for families. The characters are similarly well crafted. The main character Quasimodo is very easy to sympathize with, since he only wants to be accepted by society despite his grotesque appearance. He also provides the movie with a powerful message about how harmful prejudice is and how people shouldn't be judged by their appearances. Phoebus and Esmeralda are similarly sympathetic with how they're some of the only people who accept Quasimodo for what he is. I also love how, even though Quasimodo is in love with Esmeralda, he doesn't end up with her in the end. Instead, he's accepted by the townspeople, which is arguably more fulfilling for him. But my absolute favorite character in the movie has to be Judge Frodo. He might just be my favorite Disney villain of all time. Not only does he have a menacing demeanor, complete with a powerful voice by Tony Jay, but he's also surprisingly complex. He constantly does horrible things to Quasimodo and the gypsies, but always tries to justify his actions. He even developed sexual feelings for Esmeralda despite him hating all gypsies.
Destroy Esmeralda and let her taste the fires of hell, or else let her be mine and mine alone.
The only characters I'm not as fond of are the gargoyles. While I wouldn't say I hate them as much as other people do, they can still be pretty annoying, and their antics often clash with the film's mostly serious tone. However, unlike the animals in Pocahontas, the gargoyles also play an important role in the story by encouraging Quasimodo and giving him someone at the cathedral to talk to.
As your friends and guardians, we insist you attend the festival.
Me? No, the Pope. Of course you!
At the same time, though, I also think there is a huge missed opportunity with them. At first, it seems like the gargoyles are figments of Quasimodo's imagination, which would have been a very intriguing idea. But then we see the gargoyles interact with other characters and even help out in the final battle, which basically confirms that they're real. The animation is another major highlight. Of course, the character animation, colors, and lighting are all spectacular, but the backgrounds and set pieces are probably the best aspects. They perfectly establish the film's Renaissance-era Paris setting and give some breathtaking views of the Notre Dame Cathedral. The songs, once again by Alan Menken and Stephen Schwartz, are not only amazing in their own right, but I would say that they're some of Menken and Schwartz's best work. My favorites would have to be the opening song, The Bells of Notre Dame, which perfectly sets up the story in a gripping way, and Frodo's song, Hellfire, which is one of the darkest and most powerful Disney songs of all time.
This burning desire is turning me to sin.
The only song I'm not crazy about is the gargoyle song, A Guy Like You, but even that one isn't too bad. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a truly amazing movie unlike anything Disney had done up to that point, and we probably won't see them do something like it again. Plus, it's a million times better than that awful direct-to-video sequel. Seriously, avoid that thing like the plague it is. But as for the original, I'm more than happy to give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Up next is Hercules.
Hercules, 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 Hercules!
This movie was only a moderate success when it first came out, but it's gained a big cult following over the years. Personally, while it definitely has some good stuff in it, I find Hercules to be one of the weaker films of the Disney Renaissance. Let's get my biggest problem out of the way first, which is the film's tone. Obviously, this is an adaptation of the Greek myth of the same name, also known as Hercules, but of course it takes a lot of creative liberties. The film was full of pop culture references and other jokes to make it seem more modern, which for me can feel pretty obnoxious. My guess is that the filmmakers wanted to make something like Aladdin, which also had a lot of this type of humor, especially since this was from the same directors as Aladdin, Ron Clements and John Musker. I'm not sure why, but I don't think that style works quite as well in Hercules. It might be because in Aladdin, the modern references were usually saved for the genie and occasionally Iago, but here they're all over the film. Like I said, I found this to be pretty obnoxious, but most people probably won't mind it. The characters aren't much more interesting. The titular character, Hercules, is kind of a bland hero. He's the typical underdog who has to prove himself to others. We've seen this type of character in a lot of other movies, and unfortunately Hercules doesn't do much to set himself apart. Herc's love interest, Megara, has an enjoyably sassy personality, which makes her stand out from other Disney heroines, but like Hercules, she's not particularly complex beyond that. They try to give her an interesting backstory by showing how she had her heart broken in the past and doesn't want to be in love ever again, but that's not really enough to make her interesting in my opinion. There's also Hercules' trainer Phil, who's basically just Danny DeVito playing himself, though that's not much of an issue as I love Danny DeVito. As for my favorite character, it has to be the villain, Hades. I find Hades to be one of the most memorable Disney villains, managing to be both hilarious and genuinely threatening. And as much as I hate to say it since he's such a garbage person in real life, James Woods does do a great job voicing him. And much like Robin Williams as the genie, he improvised many of his lines.
Well, they're just fine, a little dark, a little gloomy, and as always, hey, full of dead people. What are you gonna do?
Another major highlight of Hercules is the animation. Of course, the colors, effects, backgrounds, and character animation are all amazing. But it also has a unique style for a Disney movie. It combines ancient Greek art with the style of Gerald Scarfe of the Wall fame, and it works surprisingly well. The songs are similarly enjoyable, with my favorite probably being Meg's song, I Won't Say I'm in Love.
It's too cliche, I won't say I'm in love.
My only nitpick with the songs is that they don't really stick to one genre. Most of them are done in a gospel style, but I Won't Say I'm in Love sounds like an early 60s pop song, Go to the Distance is a more traditional Disney ballad, and One Last Hope is done in an old Broadway style. But still, the songs are some of the most memorable aspects of the film, which isn't surprising seeing as how they're once again done by Alan Menken. Overall, Hercules is a bit of a mixed bag. I can see how some people really like it, and I also like it to a certain extent, but I just don't find it to be one of Disney's best. I will say this though, the animation's great, the songs are great, and Hades is great. Everything else is just okay in my opinion. 6 out of 10. Oh, and one more thing.
It looks like Vegas! Why does it look like Vegas? And it's like, because Vegas looks like Greece, you fucking idiot.
Our next movie is Mulan from 1998, the year of my birth, which was notably the first movie made entirely in Disney's animation studio at the Disney MGM Park in Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida. Since the studio opened with the park in 1989, it had provided some animation for all of Disney's movies at that point, but this was the first time making an entire film by themselves. And for the first effort, they did a pretty good job. While not one of the best movies from the Renaissance, Mulan still has plenty of elements that make it a pretty solid film. Let's start with the titular character, Mulan, who was one of the strongest female leads Disney had created at that point. Despite society telling her that she has to be submissive to men, Mulan proves them wrong by taking her father's place in the war against the Huns. She does this by disguising as a man, which can lead to some pretty funny moments.
I mean, sorry you had to see that, but you know how it is when you get those, manly urges, and you just gotta kill something.
Her love interest, Shane, and the other members of the army are similarly likable. They all have memorable personalities and a great sense of camaraderie among each other. Mulan's sidekick, the dragon Mushu, also has some pretty funny moments, but once again, it sort of feels like Eddie Murphy is just playing himself, which can be a bit distracting at times. But the weakest character is probably Shan Yu, who I personally find to be one of the most bland and forgettable villains in any Disney movie. The animation is unique for Disney in that it combines the typical Disney style with elements of traditional Chinese art, and it pulls off that balance really well. And of course, since this is a war movie, it also provides us with some really well staged action scenes. What doesn't work as well though are the songs. This may be a bit controversial, but I don't think Mulan really needed to be a musical. In fact, it's a bit debatable to even call this a musical as there are only 4 songs throughout the entire film, and they all only appear in the first half. Thankfully, 2 of the songs, I'll Make a Man Out of You and Reflections, are standout numbers, especially the former, which is one of my favorite Disney songs of all time.
You must be swift as the coursing river, with all the force of a great typhoon, with all the strength of a raging fire, mysterious as the dark side of the moon.
The rest, though, are not memorable at all, which only further shows how the musical numbers don't really feel necessary here. If you don't believe me, try singing a few bars of You'll Bring Honor to Us All without looking it up beforehand. On the bright side though, the songs were made better by Jerry Goldsmith's excellent score. Overall, while it's certainly no masterpiece, Mulan still has a lot to offer with likable characters, great animation, and intense action. The only things weighing it down are its hit-or-miss soundtrack and a few characters that aren't super likable or interesting. But at least it's better than the remake, or at least I assume it is because I haven't seen the remake and have no interest in doing so. 7 out of 10. Now we get to the last movie in the Disney Renaissance, as well as the last Disney movie from the 20th century, Tarzan. Over the years, there have been many cinematic adaptations of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan stories, but the Disney version is arguably the most famous one of all, and for good reason. While it's not necessarily a perfect movie, Tarzan is still really fun from beginning to end. The best and most compelling aspect of Tarzan is the self-conflict faced by the titular character. Tarzan feels unwelcome by some of his gorilla family, and is overjoyed when other humans come to his home. The only problem is that Tarzan now has to choose between his gorilla family and the humans. This presents a very intriguing dilemma that the movie takes great advantage of. I especially love the scene early on when a young Tarzan covers himself in mud to look like a gorilla.
And do you know what I see? I see 2 eyes, like mine, and a nose somewhere. Ah, here. 2 ears. And let's see, what else?
2 hands?
That's right.
There's also some enjoyable side characters. Jane is a really fun character on her own, but she also has a great romance with Tarzan. Not to mention that Minnie Driver does a terrific job voicing her.
And I was saved! I was saved by a flying wild man in a loincloth.
Loincloth? Good Lord.
What is she talking about?
I hadn't the foggiest idea. Takes after her mother, you know. She'd come up with stories like that. Not about men in loincloths, of course, but...
Tarzan's friends, Turk and Tantor, can also be pretty funny, but don't feel like they make a significant impact on the plot. There's also the villain, Clayton, who isn't one of the most interesting or memorable Disney villains. Like Governor Ratcliffe from Pocahontas, he's motivated entirely by greed, which makes him kind of boring to watch. In fact, probably the most interesting aspect of Clayton is, oddly enough, his death scene, which is one of the darkest deaths in any Disney movie. The animation, unsurprisingly, is spectacular. This was the first Disney movie to use a new technique called deep canvas, which allowed the animators to work in a more three-dimensional environment and give the backgrounds an unprecedented amount of depth. This helps make the jungle environment in the movie feel very immersive. The character animation is similarly amazing, especially Glenn Keane's work on the titular character. He did a great job animating Tarzan's acrobatic skills, which he based on skateboarding videos, and impressive physique. Animation really is the best medium to tell the Tarzan story for this reason. There are no limits to how Tarzan can move. Tarzan was also the first Disney movie since The Rescuers Down Under to not be a true musical. There are a couple scenes in which characters sing, but they don't really count as musical numbers. Instead, Disney brought in Phil Collins to write several songs which play in the background. This is one of the more divisive aspects of Tarzan, since people either love Collins songs or think they ruin the movie. Personally, I'm somewhere in the middle. I think the songs are very enjoyable by themselves, but feel somewhat out of place in this movie. Honestly, the songs probably should have just been musical numbers, since many of them are just explaining how Tarzan feels. But like I said, they're still really good. My favorite of the songs would probably be either the ballad You'll Be in My Heart, or Strangers Like Me. Overall, despite a few forgettable characters and songs that don't really fit the movie, Tarzan is still an extremely fun ride with some interesting themes. It's a pretty good way to cap off the Disney Renaissance, and I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. After Tarzan's release, the world would enter a new millennium. As Disney entered this new era, the company was in a bit of a different state than it was 10 years earlier. The death of Frank Wells and the departure of Jeffrey Katzenberg in 1994 had definitely left a scar in the company, and the films from the latter half of the Renaissance weren't doing quite as well as the ones that came before it. This was mainly due to changes in the animation industry as a whole. In 1995, Pixar, the studio that had developed the CAP system, released the first fully computer-animated film, Toy Story. The film was an unexpected smash hit, and soon other studios, including Katzenberg's new company DreamWorks, would make their own computer-animated films to similar success. Slowly but surely, hand-drawn animation was falling by the wayside, and over the next several years, Disney struggled to keep up with these new trends. This started a period I like to call Disney's experimental era. This was a time when Disney decided that the whole animated musical based on a popular myth or fairy tale genre was starting to run its course. So for most of the 2000s, Disney released some movies that tried out new ideas that they hadn't really done before. As you can imagine, the results were pretty mixed, as we'll see in the next several movies. The first movie in this new era, as well as the first movie released in the new millennium, was Fantasia 2000. Okay, technically it had its premiere in December 1999, but it didn't get a wide release until January 1st, 2000. This was also the first time since The Rescuers Down Under when Disney made a direct sequel to one of their animated films. And no, the direct-to-video sequels don't count because those were made by a separate studio. Honestly, out of all the Disney movies to make sequels out of, Fantasia would be close to the bottom of my list. The original was an absolute masterpiece unlike any other movie before it or since. How could you possibly replicate that? On the other hand, the advancements in technology since the first Fantasia could allow for some new and creative ideas for segments. Not to mention that there were many segments in Fantasia that were cut but could be brought back in a sequel. Fantasia 2000 definitely takes advantage of the former, but it still isn't quite as ambitious or as memorable as its predecessor. That's not to say this movie is bad at all. The animators still did an amazing job with the tools they were given. As I said earlier, the advancements in technology allow a greater variety of animation styles in each segment. Not to mention how they make great use of computer animation. In fact, the Piano Concerto No. 2 segment, which tells the story of Hans Christian Andersen's The Steadfast Tin Soldier, is noteworthy as being the first time Disney created fully computer animated characters. The results are surprisingly great, managing to blend in with the 2D elements really well. Some other standout segments include the Pines of Rome, which also makes great use of CGI, and the opening segment Symphony No. 5, which, like Toccata and Fugue from the first Fantasia, is somewhat abstract with some beautiful colors. I also like how they included the original Sorcerer's Apprentice segment as a little tribute to the first film. But my favorite segment has to be Rhapsody in Blue, directed by Eric Goldberg. The short brings the art style of caricaturist Al Hirschfeld to life with a very heartwarming story that perfectly matches Gershwin's original piece. However, there are also some segments, like Carnival of the Animals and Pomp and Circumstance, that have a more cartoony style than the others. These shorts are fine on their own, but they feel like they would have been better suited for one of Disney's package films from the 40s than Fantasia. But easily, the worst aspect of Fantasia 2000 is the host segments in between. Unlike the first film, which had only one live-action host, this movie brought in a number of celebrities to introduce each short. Some of them, like James Earl Jones and Angela Lansbury, do a pretty good job, but others like Steve Martin, Bette Midler, and Penn and Teller try to add some comedy into their segments, which comes off as, for lack of a better word, kinda cringe.
All right, boys, let's... Oh, sorry. Could I have another stick thingy, please?
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
But despite that, Fantasia 2000 is well worth watching for its amazing animation. Sure, it's not as good as the original Fantasia, but then again, few movies are. 8 out of 10. Later in 2000, Disney released Dinosaur. It's honestly a bit debatable if this movie should even be included in the Walt Disney Animation Studios catalog. Technically, it was made by another division at Disney called the Secret Lab. However, this was the only movie that department ever made, and it was considered an offshoot of the animation studio, so I guess this movie barely counts. Because of that, this is actually the first movie from Walt Disney Animation Studios to be fully computer animated. Well, sort of. See, this movie used the then innovative technique of placing computer animated characters against live-action backgrounds. Originally, the movie was supposed to be made in stop motion, but after the release of Jurassic Park in 1993, Disney decided to delay the film until they could create the dinosaurs with computer animation. The results are pretty impressive for the time, although it's sadly pretty obvious that the dinosaurs are computer animated, since the textures and lighting feel a bit off. But still, considering this movie is over 20 years old, the animation has aged surprisingly well. In addition, the backgrounds give us some great scenic shots, especially in the opening sequence. Unfortunately, that's one of the only noteworthy aspects of this film. While not a horrible movie, Dinosaur is extremely boring and forgettable. The plot is your standard finding a new home narrative that we've already seen in plenty of other movies, including, ironically, The Land Before Time, and this movie doesn't really put an interesting spin on it. The characters are similarly uninteresting, including the main character Aladar and his love interest, Nera. These characters and most of the side ones have little to no personality behind them, though at least they aren't annoying. That's more than I could say about Aladar's adoptive lemur brother whose name I can't even remember. His whole personality is basically being horny and always trying and failing to impress girls. This gets annoying pretty quickly, and the character ends up feeling out of place and unimportant to the plot.
What you need is a little help from the love monkey.
I should also point out that the dinosaurs weren't originally supposed to talk, but Eisner convinced the team to have them talk anyway so the movie could be more marketable. But honestly, the movie would have been so much better and more interesting if the characters weren't talking all the time. Thanks, Eisner. But another aspect that does stand out in this movie is, oddly enough, the score, composed by James Newton Howard. It's pretty rare for a film's score to be the best part of it, but honestly, Howard did an amazing job, turning out a sweeping, epic soundtrack that is probably better than the movie deserved. I honestly had a hard time with this review because there just isn't much to talk about with Dinosaur. Despite some impressive visuals for the time and a surprisingly great score, the film's unoriginal story and bland characters make it an extremely boring experience. Honestly, this might have to be the first movie on this list to get a 4 out of 10. Sure, it has some decent qualities, but the problems I listed aren't enough to make the experience worthwhile. Up next is The Emperor's New Groove, and thankfully this one is a huge improvement over Dinosaur. But before we get into the movie itself, let's talk a bit about its production history, which I find just as interesting. Originally, this film was planned as a musical called Kingdom of the Sun, an adaptation of The Prince of the Pauper set in the Incan Empire. It focused on a selfish emperor named Manco, voiced by David Spade, who meets a humble llama herder named Pacha, voiced by Owen Wilson, who looks just like him. After Monka was turned into a llama by a sorcerer named Yzma, voiced by Eartha Kitt, the two must switch places until they can reverse the spell. The film was to be directed by Lion King co-director Roger Allers and longtime Disney animator Mark Dendall, and Steen was hired to do the songs. However, Disney executives weren't happy with how the story was turning out and asked for a lot of changes. This caused Roger Allers to leave the project, and in turn, Dendall, screenwriter David Reynolds, and head of story Chris Williams completely changed the film by scrapping the songs and giving it a much more comedic tone. In the end, the only things left from Kingdom of the Sun were the South American setting, some of the characters' names of voice actors, and the basic premise of an emperor turning into a llama. If you want to learn more about this story, I recommend watching the fascinating documentary The Sweatbox, though it's pretty hard to find. Honestly, I'm kind of glad Kingdom of the Sun was turned into this movie. While I'm sure it would have been a good film, it probably would have just been another Disney musical without much to set itself apart from the others. With New Groove, on the other hand, Disney made a movie unlike anything they had done before. The film's tone is much more in line with the Looney Tunes than Disney, providing us with some great comedy. This film was constantly throwing jokes at you, and the majority of them hit bullseyes. The animation reflects this really well, going for a more cartoony style than most Disney movies, and providing some great facial expressions and slapstick comedy. But even without the great comedy, the film still has a very heartwarming story. It focuses on the main character Kuzco trying to get back to the throne while also becoming a better person with the help of Pacha, voiced by John Goodman, who does a really good job.
Hey, listen, Pacha. You know, what I said to you back at the diner, I didn't really...
So, you tired of being a llama?
Yes!
However, this also leads to probably my biggest problem with the movie. Kuzco is so selfish at the beginning that it's hard to sympathize with him. I get that the idea is that he becomes nicer as the story goes on, and he does start to be more likable towards the end, but at first the movie doesn't really give us much of a reason to root for Kuzco, to the point where I end up not caring if he becomes emperor again.
Hate your hair. Not likely. Yikes, 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 and let me guess, you have a great personality.
But this might be more of a personal issue than a legit criticism. And like I said, the story still has a lot of heart. Not only with Kuzco and Pacha, but also the moments with Pacha's family. There's also the issue of the film having a mostly white cast even though it's set in South America, but that's a whole other discussion. But probably my favorite characters, even more so than the two protagonists, are the villains, Yzma and her assistant Kronk. They have an amazing dynamic that's made even better by Eartha Kitt and Patrick Warburton's hilarious voice performances. They end up providing some of the funniest moments in the whole film.
Tell us where the talking llama is, and we'll burn your house to the ground.
Don't you mean or?
Tell us where the talking llama is, or we'll burn your house to the ground.
Overall, while I wouldn't call it perfect, The Emperor's New Groove is an extremely fun watch with plenty of great jokes, mostly likable characters, and a very heartwarming story. I'm giving the movie a 7 out of 10, though it does come pretty close to being an 8. Sure, it may not be one of my favorites, but The Emperor's New Groove definitely deserves the title of the funniest animated Disney movie. Now we move on to another unique experiment from Disney, Atlantis: The Lost Empire. Like The Emperor's New Groove, this is another case of Disney trying a genre they had never really explored before, which in this case is a full-on action-adventure. It's clear that Disney wanted this to appeal to a slightly older demographic, as Atlantis was actually the first animated film since the Black Cauldron to get a PG rating. I still think Hunchback should have gotten that rating though. Sadly, the movie got mixed reviews and was a box office disappointment when it first came out, which is a shame because I think Atlantis is a fun ride from beginning to end. The film follows a historian and budding explorer named Milo Thatch, who wants to fulfill his late grandfather's dream of finding the lost city of Atlantis. Milo is an extremely likable character, partially because he's probably the nerdiest Disney protagonist, so I definitely relate to him. Milo finally gets his chance when he joins a crew formed by a friend of his grandfather, and together they manage to find the lost city with some interesting developments along the way. Outside of Milo, the film was full of likable and interesting characters, from the bizarre Moliere, to the chaotic Vinny, to the tough and sarcastic Audrey, to the kind Dr. Sweet.
Here, I'm gonna need you to fill these up.
With what?
Not only do these characters have memorable personalities, but they each have interesting backstories and have a great dynamic with each other. The Atlantean people, including the Princess Kida, are also well developed, and the filmmakers give Atlantis a really interesting culture and history. The only character who I find really uninteresting is Commander O'Rourke, who ends up being the villain, which isn't really a spoiler as the movie makes it pretty obvious. Like Governor Ratcliffe from Pocahontas and Clayton from Tarzan, always interested in is raiding Atlantis so he can make money. We've seen this type of villain countless times, and they're never really that interesting or memorable.
Get off your soapbox, Thatch. You've read Darwin. It's called natural selection. We're just helping it along.
As for the story, while it isn't necessarily bad, it does come off as slightly unoriginal, borrowing elements from stories like 20,000 Leagues and the Indiana Jones films. Not to mention that it can be very exposition heavy, which can make it a bit hard to follow. Another highlight of the movie is the animation, which, once again, goes for a unique style for Disney. The team hired Hellboy creator Mike Mignola to help design the characters, and his art style fits really well with the movie's action-packed tone. The backgrounds also do a great job of portraying each environment, from the ocean depths to deep dark caves and the city of Atlantis itself. The latter, along with the Atlanteans' detailed culture, helps give the film some great world building. There's also a lot of really cool technology present, from the Jules Verne-esque equipment of the explorers to the mysterious tools and vehicles of the Atlanteans. And of course, the animation also provides some great action scenes, which heighten the stakes of the story with huge explosions, monstrous creatures, and how it doesn't hold back from showing actual deaths.
7 hours ago, we started this expedition with 200 of the finest men and women I've ever known. We're all that's left.
Overall, despite being held back by a cliché story and boring villain, Atlantis The Lost Empire certainly makes up for it with beautiful animation, likable characters, intense action, and imaginative world building. It definitely deserved better when it first came out, and I'm glad more people are starting to appreciate it. Atlantis gets a 7 out of 10. Up next is Lilo and Stitch from 2002. This was the second movie produced entirely by Disney's animation studio in Florida. It was also the directorial debut of Chris Sanders and Dean DeBlois, who would later create the How to Train Your Dragon trilogy for DreamWorks. This was yet another unique departure for Disney, telling a story about aliens that also shows the importance of family. Despite how different it was, Lilo and Stitch was a hit with both critics and audiences. This was great news for Disney Animation, since their last few films hadn't made much money at the box office. Since then, the film ended up spawning a pretty successful franchise throughout the 2000s, including a TV series, 2 direct-to-video sequels, and even a theme park attraction. Lilo and Stitch definitely deserved the success it had, and was probably the best movie from Disney's experimental era. The best part of the film, and where most of the heart comes from, is the relationship between Lilo and her sister Nani. After their parents sadly passed away, Nani was left to raise Lilo as her own, and now has to prevent her from being taken away by social services. Lilo is also one of the best written child characters in any Disney movie. She's not the squeaky clean role model we see in most Disney kids. Sure, she's not really a bad kid, but she can be hyper, moody, and temperamental, which only further complicates Nani's situation. Lilo also forms a nice relationship with Stitch. At first, Stitch is completely chaotic and tries to destroy everything around him. But he slowly forms an attachment with Lilo and sees her and her sister as his family.
Oh, I love the found family trope!
I also like how the movie doesn't really have a clear antagonist. The closest we get is the social worker, Bubbles, but the film makes it clear that he doesn't really have any bad intentions and is just doing his job.
I know you're trying, Nani, but you need to think about what's best for Lilo. Even if it removes you from the picture.
There's also Captain Gantu, who tries to capture Stitch, but he doesn't play a big role until the film's climax, and once again, you could argue that he's just doing his job. The animation is another major highlight. Of course, the character animation is as great as usual, but it also manages to capture the tropical atmosphere and beauty of Hawaii, especially through its watercolor backgrounds. If I had to find a major flaw with this film, it would have to be the comedy, which often feels weak and a bit unnecessary. This is especially apparent with Jumbo and Piggy, who don't really add much to the story until the climax. But overall, Lilo and Stitch is not only a lot of fun, but also surprisingly complex. It definitely deserves an 8 out of 10. On the same year as Lilo and Stitch, Disney released Treasure Planet. This is another case where the movie's production history is arguably more interesting than the movie itself. For years, Ron Clements and John Musker had wanted to make a sci-fi adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. They originally pitched the idea to Disney in the mid-80s, along with The Little Mermaid. Disney rejected both ideas at first, but later brought back Little Mermaid. Afterwards, Clements and Musker would pitch Treasure Planet several more times, but instead they were assigned to direct movies like Aladdin and Hercules. When Disney first approached them about Hercules, they said they would only direct it if they could make Treasure Planet right afterwards. This was clearly a huge passion project for the duo, but it sadly didn't turn out very well. Upon its release, Treasure Planet received mixed reviews and was one of the biggest box office bombs, not just in Disney history, but in movie history in general, losing over $70 million. But thankfully, the movie has developed a bit of a cult following in recent years. With all that in mind, did Treasure Planet really deserve to be such a flop? Honestly, no. While I wouldn't say I love this movie, I still enjoy it somewhat. For me, the biggest highlight has to be the visuals, which combine the Victorian aesthetic with futuristic technology, creating a very steampunk-like world. Atlantis also played with this style, but Treasure Planet leans into it much more heavily. Because of that, your enjoyment of the film partially relies on how you feel about steampunk. Steampunk is a very polarizing style, with some loving how unique it is, while others see it as tacky. Personally, I kinda like steampunk, although I'm not as into it as some are, so I didn't mind it. In fact, I think this film ended up creating a very unique world that's different from pretty much every other Disney movie. Also, much like Tarzan and Atlantis, this movie makes great use of the deep canvas technique, which really immerses us in the environment. The backgrounds also do a great job of giving us a more fantastical look at outer space than what we usually see. And this doesn't have to do with the animation, but once again, James Newton Howard delivers a great score, even though some of the music is very of its time. Get ready to hear a lot of early 2000s butt rock. Well, that just about covers the presentation aspect of this movie. Let's talk about content. I personally find the protagonist, Jim Hawkins, to not be a very interesting character. He's your typical rebellious teen who dreams of adventure, and the movie doesn't do much to make him stand out, even if they give him a somewhat interesting backstory where his father abandoned him at a young age. What works better, though, is Jim's relationship with Long John Silver. At first, Silver sees Jim as an obstacle in his mission to get the treasure, but he slowly forms a bond with him which complicates his plans.
You give up a few things, chasing a dream.
Was it worth it?
I'm hoping it is, Jimbo.
As for the side characters like Captain Amelia and Delbert, they aren't particularly complex but are likable overall. I can't say the same thing about the characters Morph and Ben, who are just there for comic relief and end up coming off as kind of annoying.
I've been marooned for so long. I mean, solitude's fun. Don't get me wrong, for heaven's sakes, after 100 years, you got a little nuts!
Overall, while it has some problems like uninteresting characters, Treasure Planet is still a pretty fun movie with beautiful animation and creative world building. Even though I don't love the movie, I can see how it managed to get a cult following, as it is one of the most unique movies in Disney's catalog. 6 out of 10. Up next is Brother Bear from 2003. This was the third and last movie to be made by Disney's Florida studio before it shut down. It also happens to be the first animated Disney film I saw in theaters, or at least the first one I remember seeing, so you could say it has a bit of a special place in my heart. Outside of that though, this movie is definitely a mixed bag. It has some really good elements and others that just weigh it down. The first act of the story is actually quite engaging, which follows the main character Kenai, voiced by the Joker himself, Joaquin Phoenix.
How about another joke, Murray?
No, I think we've had enough of your jokes.
What do you get?
I don't think so.
When you cross
I think
a man
with a bear.
I'll tell you what you get!
Call the police.
Get what you fucking deserve!
And his older brothers, Danahi and Sitka. Sitka has to guide his brothers and keep them out of trouble. The characters are surprisingly fleshed out, which makes it even sadder when Sitka is killed by a bear. Kenai takes revenge and kills the bear. As punishment, the spirits turn Kenai into a bear. And that's when the story kinda goes downhill for me. Once Kenai becomes a bear, the story suddenly becomes more lighthearted and kid-friendly, with comedy that doesn't usually land. This is especially apparent with the characters Rut and Toot, who are pretty annoying and don't really add anything to the story.
Rut? Go away, I'm eating twigs. Rut?
Go away, you're breaking my concentration, eh?
Coda, the other main character, can also get pretty grating, but he does form a pretty heartwarming relationship with Kenai. The story does pick up towards the end and becomes more engaging, but the second act is still pretty boring to sit through. One major highlight, though, is the animation. The backgrounds and lighting perfectly immerse us in the natural beauty of the Pacific Northwest, and the animals are animated in a convincing and naturalistic way. There's also some beautiful effects. The scene where Kenai transforms into a bear is particularly breathtaking. Like Tarzan, this movie features songs by Phil Collins, and like before, they can be pretty hit or miss and feel somewhat unnecessary. The worst example is when Kenai has to tell Coda that he killed his mother as a human. This should have been a very dramatic scene, but the whole time they play a Phil Collins song over it, which completely ruins the tone.
Really? What's it about?
Well, it's kind of about a man, and kind of about a bear, but mostly it's about a monster. A monster who did something so bad.
Everywhere I turn, I hurt someone.
But overall, Brother Bear definitely has some stuff to like, including beautiful animation and engaging drama in the first act, even if it's weighed down by a confused tone. 6 out of 10. And now, we come to Home on the Range. When I did my first Disney marathon back in 2020, this was one of the few movies that I hadn't seen beforehand, and it was the one I was least looking forward to watching. And while I wouldn't say it was quite as bad as I was anticipating, it's still one of the weakest efforts from Disney Animation. The biggest problem with Home on the Range is that it just feels really watered down for a Disney film. Usually Disney is able to appeal to both kids and adults, but here it would be hard for anyone older than a kid to enjoy it. The movie puts most of its focus on the comedy, but unfortunately most of the comedy just falls flat. A lot of it is just slapstick humor, which could work if handled well, but this movie relies on it way too heavily. Sure, there were a few chuckle-worthy moments, but even those were few and far between. On top of that, the story and characters are not that engaging at all. The story is just about a group of cows led by Maggie who tries to save the farm from bankruptcy. The story doesn't have much going on beyond that, meaning that the stakes don't really feel that high. The characters either come off as bland or, in the case of Maggie and Buck the horse, annoying.
Yeah, they're real. Quit staring.
The only character I found myself enjoying at all is the villain Alistair Slim, who, along with his minions, provides some of the only mildly funny moments.
One last time. Who am I?
Uncle Slim?
Correct. Now, I put on my hat, then I put on my spectacles.
Ah! Hey, who are you? Where's Uncle Slim?
Oh!
The only major bright spot of the movie is the animation. Like The Emperor's New Groove, it goes for a more cartoony style. And while it doesn't work quite as well as that film, the animators still did a good job. And admittedly, since this was the last hand-drawn Disney film for a while, it is nice to see some good 2D animation one last time. But overall, outside of some good animation and a few funny moments, Home on the Range really doesn't have much to offer. Even the songs, co-written by Alan Menken for the first time since Hercules, are mostly forgettable, with only a couple songs standing out to me, those being Little Patch of Heaven and Will the Sun Ever Shine Again. The latter was written by Menken after the 9/11 attacks to reflect how hopeless many Americans were feeling at the time.
Rain is pouring down like the heavens are hurt. Seems like it's been dark since the devil knows when.
It's surprisingly effective and deserved to be in a much better movie than Home on the Range. I tried to keep an open mind with this movie, and like I said, it's not as bad as I expected. I'm sure the crew did the best they could with this idea, but I still expect better from Disney. That's why, unfortunately, I have to give this movie a 4 out of 10. But, as bad as Home on the Range is, one good thing I can say is that at least it isn't as bad as our next movie. Chicken Little sucks, let's talk about it. After their last few movies failed to make much, if any, profit, Disney wondered what they were doing wrong. Then they realized a growing trend in the animation industry. Ever since the success of Toy Story, studios like Pixar, DreamWorks, and Blue Sky had been making computer-animated films to great success, while hand-drawn animation, like what Disney was still doing, was starting to fail. If you don't believe me, just look at the box office numbers for Finding Nemo in the first two Shrek movies and compare them to Treasure Planet and DreamWorks' Sinbad. So to keep up with the times, Michael Eisner decided to shut down Disney's hand-drawn animation department, along with the entire studio in Florida, which later became a theme park attraction rather than a real functioning studio. For the next few years, Disney would only make computer-animated films. Chicken Little was the first result of this change, and boy, it did not leave a good first impression. Chicken Little is, in my opinion, the worst movie the Walt Disney Animation Studios has ever made. I liked it as a kid, but looking back, it does not hold up at all. It's hard to know where to even begin with this movie's flaws, but let's start with the story. One thing that always stands out to me is how surprisingly mean-spirited this movie can be. The titular character Chicken Little is constantly bullied by pretty much everyone in the town, including his own father, Buck Luck. This leads to one of the movie's fatal flaws. Buck is probably the least likable Disney character that we're supposed to like. Throughout the whole film, he makes it clear how disappointed he is in his son, but makes little to no effort to connect with him. I guess that the point is that he starts out as a bad father, but becomes better later on, but Buck is so unlikable that by the time he does finally learn his lesson, it doesn't feel earned. The comedy, like Home on the Range, is also extremely weak. Sure, there's a few mildly funny moments, but most of the comedy just falls flat. It relies pretty heavily on pop culture references, an obvious attempt to compete with studios like DreamWorks, and it just feels extremely forced. For example, there's one scene where Chicken Little and his friends are talking about something, I don't know, and the whole time the fish is doing some King Kong parody on the side that adds nothing and just feels pointless. Some of the story elements are also just confusing. There's this whole side plot where Chicken Little gains the respect of the town by winning a baseball game, but then the town goes back to hating him once he discovers that the sky is falling. So, what the fuck was the point of the baseball stuff? It makes no sense. The world building is also pretty confusing. Technically, the movie is set in a world similar to Robin Hood where there's only anthropomorphic animals instead of humans. But then there's a scene where some characters are watching Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they make references to stuff like Barbra Streisand.
Don't make Mommy take away your Streisand collection!
Mom, you leave Barbara out of this!
So, do humans exist in this world or not? Is it set in some post-apocalyptic society? Normally the stuff doesn't bother me, but the movie has so little going for it that I can't help but notice these flaws. Sadly, the problems don't stop at the story and characters. The animation is also really weak. For one thing, the textures and lighting on the characters and environments feel incredibly fake, and the character animation tries and fails at creating a cartoony style. I could maybe excuse that since this was Disney Animation's first fully CGI film, if you don't count Dinosaur, but here's the thing. I'm not just comparing the animation by today's standards. I think it looks bad even by 2005 standards. This movie came out the same year as Blue Sky Studios' Robots, which is also a bad film overall, but does have some great animation that holds up pretty well even today. It also came out the same year as Madagascar, which did a way better job at adapting squash and stretch animation into CG. Not to mention that a lot of the character designs are just ugly in my opinion. To me, this is the only Disney movie that I feel has bad animation. The only bright spots are the aliens and their technology, which admittedly look pretty cool. Overall, Chicken Little is a movie with barely any redeeming qualities. Sure, some of the jokes are mildly funny and the aliens look pretty cool, but that's about all this movie has going for it. I'm honestly kind of shocked that this was directed by Mark Lindahl, who also directed The Emperor's New Groove. That movie basically did everything Chicken Little did, but way better. It's a lot funnier, it has more appealing animation, and it has a more heartfelt story. I'm not wanting to put all the blame on Lindahl and his team. From what I understand, this movie went through a lot of story changes during development, so a lot of its problems probably came from interference by Disney executives. Maybe there are some people who like Chicken Little, and I'll admit that there are certainly worse movies out there, but for Disney, this is pretty low. Chicken Little gets a 3 out of 10.
Stop saying I look like Chicken Little. He's dumb, and he's a coward, and I'm not a coward!
Our next movie, 2007's Meet the Robinsons, marks a sort of transitional period for Disney animation. Shortly before Chicken Little's release, in early 2005, Michael Eisner stepped down as the CEO of the Walt Disney Company and was replaced by Bob Iger. Iger recognized that Disney wasn't doing as well as it was in the 90s and promised to make some big changes. One of his first acts as CEO was to buy Pixar. Before, Disney simply distributed Pixar's movies but didn't actually own the studio. After the purchase, the three heads of Pixar, Steve Jobs, Ed Catmull, and John Lasseter, all got something in return. Jobs joined Disney's board of directors where he served until his death in 2011, Catmull became the president of Pixar and Walt Disney Animation Studios, and Lasseter became the chief creative officer of both studios. Lasseter in particular would play a huge role in Disney Animation's success in the next decade. Meet the Robinsons was the first movie produced under this new leadership, and while it's not a great movie, it's a masterpiece compared to Chicken Little. The film follows a boy named Lewis, an orphan who dreams of being an inventor, even though his inventions usually end in failure. After a disastrous science fair, Lewis almost gives up when he meets a boy from the future named Wilbur, who promises to take Lewis to meet his mother if he fixes his invention at the fair. One thing that works really well in the story is the message of never giving up on your dreams. Granted, this is a message we get all the time in family films, but it's still a nice message and this movie handles it in a clever way. The main thing holding the story back is all the time travel elements, which can get a bit confusing and even create some plot holes. To be fair though, this is a problem among many time travel stories and it's kind of unavoidable. The comedy can also be pretty hit or miss. Some of the jokes got a good laugh out of me, while others just sort of fell flat. The movie is also full of likable characters. Lewis is a very sympathetic and relatable protagonist with how he doesn't feel widely accepted and often doubts his own skills. Wilbur and the rest of the Robinson family are enjoyably quirky, although some of the family members don't really get enough screen time. But my favorite character might be the villain, Bowler Hat Guy. Yes, that's what he's actually called. He provides some of the movie's funniest moments, and it's even at the center of a plot twist that I didn't see coming the first time I saw this.
What's going on? Why aren't you seizing the boy?
Also, without spoiling too much, Bowler Hat Guy is one of the only Disney villains who actually gets redeemed at the end. At the same time though, he can be pretty inept and isn't all that intimidating. His sidekick Dwarfs is the real brains behind their plan, and she later poses as a genuine threat to Lewis. The animation, while not great, is a huge step up from Chicken Little. The textures, lighting, and character designs have all received clear upgrades from before. The artists also got really creative with all the gadgets and buildings of the future. They all have a sort of retro future aesthetic to them, which I'm a total sucker for. But like I said, I still wouldn't call the animation great. While the textures and lighting have gotten better, they still feel a bit off, and the character movements often feel a bit stilted. On top of that, there are some moments where you can tell that they reused character models for some of the background characters. To be fair, this was Disney's first computer animated film to primarily feature humans, so these flaws can be forgivable. Overall, despite some flaws like an occasionally confusing story and animation that isn't really Disney's best, Meet the Robinsons is still a pretty fun movie with likable characters and an inspiring message. 6 out of 10. The last movie from Disney's experimental era is Bolt from 2008. This is another movie with a pretty interesting backstory, as it was originally being developed by Lilo and Stitch director Chris Sanders under the title American Dog. But once John Lasseter joined the studio, he wasn't happy with how the story was turning out, so he fired Sanders and brought in Chris Williams and Byron Howard to completely rework the film. But don't feel too bad for Chris, because afterwards he would move to DreamWorks to co-direct How to Train Your Dragon. Anyways, American Dog may have been more interesting than the movie we ended up getting. While Bolt is a pretty enjoyable film, it's one of the more forgettable efforts from Disney. Let's start with one of the big positives, the animation. Disney's computer animation skills have advanced even more since Meet the Robinsons. While it's still not quite on par with what Pixar was doing at the time, the character animation, textures, effects, and lighting have all gotten better. The story also has a pretty interesting setup. In the opening scenes, if you didn't know what this movie was about, you would assume that it was part of the actual story. Instead, it turns out to be a TV show within the film, which the title character Bolt stars in and thinks it's real. After Bolt gets separated from his owner, Penny, he has to go across the country to find her, while realizing that his life isn't what he thought it was. This can lead to some pretty funny moments, though Bolt's character arc reminds me a bit too much of Buzz in the first Toy Story movie. And is it just me, or is the movie's premise kinda similar to that of The Truman Show? But still, the movie does take advantage of this clever idea, not to mention that the scenes of the TV show have some impressive action. Outside of that though, the movie isn't necessarily bad, but there's not much about it that stands out. It's mostly your typical talking animals movie with a lot of the pet-related humor you would expect from those films. The characters don't offer a lot of surprises either. Mittens is the wisecracking, cynical character who grows to like Bolt, Rhino is your typical superfan, Penny is Bolt's caring owner, etc. Speaking of Penny, one thing that surprisingly got on my nerves was her voice. Originally, she was going to be played by Chloe Grace Moretz, who voiced the younger version of the character in the first scene. At the last minute though, she ended up getting replaced by Miley Cyrus. While Cyrus isn't terrible in the role, her voice definitely sounds out of place. Not only is it too recognizable, but she also sounds a bit too old for the part in my opinion.
Let's go.
But he never gets to be a real dog, and it would only be for the weekend, and I just want...
you know what?
This isn't a huge issue, but still a bit distracting. Overall, while Bolt is by no means a bad film, and actually has some elements that work pretty well, It's not the most memorable effort from Disney Animation. 6 out of 10. By 2009, Walt Disney Animation Studios was definitely in a better spot than it was a few years earlier. Under the leadership of Ed Catmull and John Lasseter, the studio had released Meet the Robinsons and Bolt, both of which were received pretty well both critically and commercially. But this was only the beginning of the studio's new success. Over the next decade, Disney Animation would be the most successful it had been since the first half of the Renaissance. In fact, it would sort of enter a new renaissance, where each film they put out would be a smash hit with critics and audiences. I like to refer to this era as Disney's Silver Age. Although it started all the way back in 2009, I'm listing this as the era we're currently in, and I think it's a bit too early to say whether or not we're in yet another new era of Disney Animation. Maybe I'll be proven wrong in the next few years, but we'll see. Anyways, let's look at the first movie in this new era, The Princess and the Frog from 2009. While this movie marked a new period for Disney, it also marked the return of 2D animation for the first time since Home on the Range 5 years earlier, as well as the first princess movie since Mulan all the way back in 1998. And who better to direct this return to form than Ron Clements and John Musker, the team behind classics like The Little Mermaid and Aladdin. When the movie was released, it got really good reviews from critics, but sadly wasn't as much of a box office hit as Disney was hoping it would be. Which is a shame because for the most part, The Princess and the Frog is a fun throwback to Disney's fairy tale movies. The movie is set in 1920s New Orleans, where a waitress named Tiana, much like in the fairy tale, kisses a prince named Naveen who has turned into a frog. The only twist is that since she isn't a princess, Tiana has turned into a frog as well, so now she and Naveen have to work together to become human again. The movie has a cast of really likable characters. Tiana and Naveen have a great relationship where they start out disliking each other but gradually fall in love as they get to know each other. On their own, however, they're still interesting to watch, especially Tiana, who's trying to fulfill her late father's dream of opening a restaurant. The side characters, while not particularly complex, are still fun to watch and have some really funny moments, especially Tiana's friend Lottie.
You know, I was starting to think that wishing on stars was just for babies and crazy people.
And spoilers, I guess, even though the movie is 14 years old, but Ray's death scene is surprisingly really powerful. There's also Dr. Facilier, who's one of the most memorable Disney villains with his powerful voodoo powers, great character animation by Bruce W. Smith, and a fantastic voice performance by Keith David.
A tip of the hat from Dr. Facilier. How y'all doing?
I also like the film's moral of working hard to achieve your dreams, which is a message we never really got in an animated Disney film before. Of course, this movie marks Disney's return to hand-drawn animation. The only difference is that instead of animating on paper, the team used the software Toon Boom Harmony. The end result is so good though that you can't really tell the difference. The film was also full of gorgeous backgrounds that really bring the atmosphere of New Orleans to life. The songs, by Randy Newman, are another big highlight, and the style fits really well with the New Orleans setting. Most of them are pretty memorable, but my favorite has to be Dr. Facilier's song, Friends on the Other Side.
I got voodoo, I got hoodoo, I got things I ain't even tried. And I got friends on the other side. He's got friends on the other side.
I do have some pretty big criticisms, though. Like I said, this movie is a throwback to Disney's classic fairy tale movies, but that's actually part of the problem. The story borrows a lot from these movies without putting much of a unique spin on it, other than the moral of working hard. It doesn't help that the story can get a bit convoluted and hard to follow with a bunch of subplots going on at once. Also, despite the story centering on a black woman living in the South during the 1920s, it doesn't do much to address the racism of the era. That only happens in a few brief moments that barely address the issue and are honestly hard to notice the first time around. I know this is a kids movie and there's only so much they can get away with in that regard, but I still think they should have addressed it a little more. Granted, I am an extremely white male, so maybe I'm not the best person to comment on that issue. But outside of these problems, The Princess and the Frog is still a lot of fun and deserves to be called a modern Disney classic. 7 out of 10. Now we move on to the first Disney movie of the 2010s, Tangled. This film had quite a tumultuous production. Originally, it was being developed by longtime animator Glenn Keane, where it was simply titled Rapunzel, but the production proved to be so stressful that he sadly suffered a heart attack and had to drop out. Due to this issue and many others, the film spent several years in development hell and came close to being cancelled. But thankfully, when Tangled was finally released in 2010, it became Disney Animation's biggest critical and commercial success in years, and it definitely deserved it. Like The Princess and the Frog, Tangled is a return to Disney's fairy tale genre. though the story twists the formula a bit more than the previous movie. Probably the strongest aspect of Tangled is its story. It brilliantly expands on the original Rapunzel story by explaining how the titular character ended up in the tower, why her hair grows, and what happened to her after she left the tower. The story is extremely well thought out and paced, making for an engaging experience. The characters aren't quite as strong, but are still pretty well written. Rapunzel and Flynn Rider are entertaining enough by themselves, but they have a really interesting relationship where, once again, they take time to fall in love with each other instead of it happening right away. Mother Gothel, who kidnapped Rapunzel as a baby and locked her in the tower, is also an effective villain. Similar to Froda from Hunchback, she cleverly manipulates Rapunzel into staying with her, much like how an abusive parent would.
You are not leaving this tower! Ever!
Oh, great. Now I'm the bad guy.
As for the side characters, they don't stand out quite as much. Pascal is your typical animal sidekick that we've seen in a lot of other Disney movies. However, the horse Maximus is really funny and has a lot of personality, which is extra impressive seeing as how he never talks. Tangled also features Disney's best computer animation at the time. The team managed to capture the look and feel of the classic Disney style into 3D. On top of that, the lighting, textures, and environments are once again huge upgrades from before. But probably the most impressive part of the visuals is Rapunzel's hair. It must have been really difficult for the team to animate such a large amount of hair in a realistic way, but not only did they achieve that, but they also came up with many creative ways for Rapunzel to use her hair. Once again, Alan Menken returns to write the score and songs, though admittedly the music is one of the weaker aspects of this movie. The only song I absolutely loved was I See the Light.
I see the light, and it's like the fog is lifted.
The rest aren't bad, but I just don't find them to be Menken's best work. But outside of the songs and some weak side characters, Tangled is an inventive take on Disney's fairy tale formula with strong main characters, beautiful animation, and a well-crafted story. 7 out of 10. Now we get to the last hand-drawn animated film Disney has produced so far, Winnie the Pooh. Despite The Princess and the Frog not being as successful as Disney had hoped, the studio decided to give 2D animation one more chance. Since Pooh is one of Disney's biggest and most recognizable franchises, they must have thought it would give 2D the boost it deserved. So they released the movie on the exact same day as the last Harry Potter film. You can probably guess why Disney hasn't made another hand-drawn animated film. And it's a shame that happened because, for the most part, this film manages to capture the charm of the original Pooh shorts. Like the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh, there isn't really much of a linear story structure, instead just showing the lovable Pooh characters in different situations. The only constant thread throughout the whole story is Pooh's attempts to find some honey, which of course he eventually gets. The characters in this movie are just as memorable and charming as they were in the original shorts. The voice actors even do a really good job recreating their voices, though admittedly Tom Kenny as Rabbit sounds a bit too much like the Ice King.
Beehives are not on my list of Baxen-friendly items. Oh, dang it! Well, I'm out of here. Goodbye, everyone.
There's also a few scenes that feel too fast-paced or cartoony, whereas one of the things I love about the original shorts is how laid back they felt. But these are pretty minor gripes. Like I said, they managed to capture the classic Pooh tone really well. The movie also retains the sketchy animation style of the original shorts, along with the watercolor-like backgrounds. Once again, this style fits extremely well with the film, and the environment of the 100-acre wood feels almost exactly the same as it did before. The animation also provides some really creative visual gags involving the book the film is set in, along with occasionally using different art styles like chalk drawings. Another highlight is the songs, which were done by Robert and Kristen Anderson-Lopez. This was their first time working on a Disney movie. Their songs successfully capture the style of the Sherman Brothers and only add to the movie's charm. However, there are a few songs performed by Zooey Deschanel. While she doesn't do a bad job at all, I find her to feel a bit out of place in this movie. But outside of some small issues like this, Winnie the Pooh is a pretty fun throwback to a franchise that was a huge part of my childhood. Hopefully Disney makes more hand-drawn animated films in the future, because this movie proves that the medium still has a lot of potential. 7 out of 10. Our next movie is one that I was really happy to return to, Wreck-It Ralph. I love Disney movies. I love video games. This is a Disney movie about video games. When I first heard about it, I knew I had to go see it, and I wasn't disappointed. Not only does Wreck-It Ralph have a lot of fun gaming references, but it's also a great film overall. One of the things I absolutely love about this movie is its world building. The film does a great job of explaining how the video game characters live when their games are turned off. Like I said, this also leads to a lot of fun references and cameos from all sorts of video game characters. It's still pretty surreal to see characters like Bowser and Sonic in a Disney movie.
If you leave your game, stay safe, stay alert, and whatever you do, don't die. Because if you die outside your own game, you don't regenerate, ever. Game over.
You can tell that director Rich Moore has a lot of love for these games, which really helps the movie overall. The only catch is that most of these references only happen during the first act. Most of the story is spent in the racing game Sugar Rush, which looks like it would be a lot of fun despite being a Mario Kart ripoff. But outside of all the gaming references, the story and characters are just as well crafted. The titular character Ralph is pretty complex and sympathetic with how he wants to be accepted by the other Fix It Felix characters, which leads to him deciding he no longer wants to be a villain. He also forms a great relationship with Vanellope von Schweetz, who, similar to Ralph, wants to be accepted by her peers. While the two often butt heads at first, they slowly come to respect each other.
Hey, why are your hands so freakishly big?
I don't know. Why are you so freakishly annoying?
Felix and Chief Calhoun also have a really funny dynamic, with Felix falling madly in love with her. King Candy is also an amazing villain, reaching the perfect blend of funny and intimidating. He was also the first of many Disney villains to have a major plot twist, a trope that quickly got old but works really well here. I honestly didn't see it coming the first time. I should also mention that all the voice actors do a terrific job in their roles, giving each of their characters a lot of personality. As you can probably guess, the animation is also fantastic. The film greatly incorporates the art styles of various different games without any of them feeling out of place. The character animation can also get really creative. I especially like how the Fix and Felix characters move in a jittery way like retro video game characters would. It's kind of weird that Ralph and Felix don't move the same way, but I can kind of see how that would be a little distracting. Regardless of whether you're a hardcore gamer or a casual player, Wreck-It Ralph is an absolute blast, which is why I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. While Wreck-It Ralph ended up being a huge hit with critics and audiences, it was nothing compared to what came right after. But first, a little history. As far back as the early 1940s, Walt Disney was in talks with Samuel Golden Pictures to collaborate on a musical biopic based on fairy tale writer Hans Christian Andersen. Goldwyn would produce the live-action scenes, while Disney would make animated sequences based on Andersen's stories, including The Ugly Duckling, The Little Mermaid, The Steadfast Tin Soldier, and most importantly for this story, The Snow Queen. However, due to various factors like World War II, the project was ultimately scrapped, and Goldwyn would produce their own Hans Christian Andersen movie that was completely live-action. Disney would go on to make adaptations of many of Andersen's stories, including the ones I mentioned earlier, but one major exception was The Snow Queen. Over the course of 70 years, Disney would try and fail several times to adapt the story. Not only did this include many attempts from Disney Animation itself, but they also tried turning it into a Disneyland dark ride in the 1970s, and even considered giving the project to Pixar in the early 2000s. It wasn't until 2012 when production began in earnest under Tarzan director Chris Buck, who was later joined by Wreck-It Ralph co-director Jennifer Lee, making her the first woman to direct a movie for Walt Disney Animation Studios. Not only did the story take a completely different direction than previous versions, but following the success of Tangled, they decided to change its name to Frozen. Disney didn't exactly have high hopes for this movie. Most of the early marketing focused entirely on the character Olaf, leading people to incorrectly assume that Frozen was just a movie about an annoying snowman. But against all odds, Frozen not only beat out The Lion King as the highest grossing animated Disney film, but it also beat Toy Story 3 as the most successful animated film of its time. Frozen was an absolute phenomenon. Everyone was singing the songs, and you couldn't walk into a store without seeing Frozen merchandise. It's probably because of this success that Frozen has become one of the most polarizing Disney movies of all time. It seems like people either love or hate this movie. As for me, while I wouldn't say I love Frozen, I really do like it. For one thing, it has a unique story for a Disney movie, focusing mainly on the relationship between the sisters Anna and Elsa. We hadn't gotten a lot of Disney movies that centered around a sisterly bond, except for Lilo and Stitch, but that was a bit of a different relationship than this movie. Anyways, the film was about how Elsa spent most of her life hiding from Anna to protect her from her ice powers. When her powers are finally revealed after her coronation, Elsa runs away from the Kingdom of Arendelle and leaves it in an eternal winter, leaving Anna to try to set things right. Anna and Elsa have an incredibly complex relationship, where they both want to be close to each other again, but Elsa also doesn't want to hurt Anna. The other characters are pretty well written too. Kristoff doesn't have as strong of a personality as Anna or Elsa, but he and Anna do form a natural romance. There's also Olaf, who I thought I was going to hate when I first saw the trailers, and when I saw the movie, I actually found him really funny. His personality has the perfect amount of naivete to make him endearing, but not so much that he becomes annoying. Josh Gad's voice performance only adds to this, giving Olaf some hilarious moments.
Oh, look at that. I've been impaled.
The animation is also stunning. The film greatly pulled off the wintry atmosphere of Arendelle and the surrounding areas, especially with the realistic way they animated the snow. But for me, the best part of the animation is probably Elsa's ice powers, which the animators got really creative with. Of course, you can't talk about Frozen without mentioning the songs, once again written by Robert and Kristen Anderson Lopez. Look, I know the songs got overpicked to death, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't get a little sick of them after a while, but I don't care, they're still well-written songs. My favorites include the opening song Frozen Heart, which reminds me a lot of Fathoms Below from The Little Mermaid, and of course the world-famous Let It Go. Again, I know how overplayed the song is, but darn it, it became a hit for a reason. Not only is it insanely catchy, but it also provides a lot of depth to Elsa's character. In fact, the song was so good that it helped influence the decision to change Elsa from the villain of the story to Anna's sister. But despite all the positive qualities of Frozen, I do have a couple big issues. One is Anna and Elsa's parents, who made the decision to shut Elsa away from Anna and the rest of Arendelle to, quote-unquote, protect her. These two are second only to Buck Cluck from Chicken Little as the worst parents in any Disney movie. I understand why they were concerned about their kids, but seriously, this was not the best way to handle the situation. And they ended up indirectly causing a lot of problems with that decision. Another big issue is Hans, who starts off as Anna's love interest, but later turns out to be the villain. Oh, sorry, spoiler warning I guess, even though the movie's 10 years old. My problem is that Hans' turn seems to come out of nowhere to the point where he practically becomes a different character. I think the filmmakers could have made the transition a little smoother.
I'd like to formally apologize for hitting the Princess of Arendelle with my horse. And for every moment after. All that's left now is to kill Elsa and bring back summer.
But overall, while Frozen isn't the perfect movie, it still has a lot to like with a well-crafted story, complex characters, beautiful animation, and unforgettable songs. Sure, the franchise may have been oversaturated, but the first movie still turned out really good. 7 out of 10. Up next is Big Hero 6, a movie based on a Marvel comic. And no, it's not part of the MCU, although there is a Stan Lee cameo. With how much of a sensation Frozen was, following it up was no easy task. Thankfully, while Big Hero 6 wasn't nearly as successful as Frozen, it was still a pretty big hit, and for good reason. While not a great movie overall, Big Hero 6 has a lot to like, especially its characters. By themselves, the members of the titular team are not massively developed or engaging. However, their personalities allow them to form a great dynamic with each other. They have a big sense of camaraderie, which makes them pretty fun to watch. But my favorite character is easily Baymax, who provides the movie's funniest moments with his robotic, matter-of-fact manner of speaking. He's also the center of a lot of the film's most tender and heartwarming moments.
You should expect an increase in body hair, especially on your face, chest, armpits, and...
Thank you! That's enough!
This leads to another one of the movie's best qualities, which is its message of how to deal with grief. Early on in the film, the main character Hero's brother Tadashi is sadly killed in a fire, and throughout the movie we see how he learns to cope with his death, with the help of his friends like Baymax. Obviously, we've seen a lot of Disney movies where a major character dies, but very few of them actually deal with the theme of loss. Big Hero 6 is an exception to that, and it handles that theme extremely well.
Tadashi is here.
No. People keep saying he's not really gone, as long as we remember him. It still hurts.
And as usual, the animation is outstanding. The film setting of San Francisco creates a unique atmosphere, where it's basically San Francisco but with more Japanese elements and advanced technology. Speaking of which, the gadgets shown in the film are extremely creative and impressive, which make it more visually engaging. And of course, since this is a superhero movie, the animators also gave us some intense and well-choreographed action scenes. Like with Frozen, I only have two major complaints. One is its story. Outside of the theme of dealing with one's grief, there isn't really anything in the story that makes it stand out from other Disney movies or superhero films. This can cause the story to be a bit generic and predictable. This leads to my other big complaint. Once again, this movie features a twist villain, and like Frozen, it doesn't handle it in the best way. Early on, the movie wants you to think that the tech CEO Alistair Gray is the villain, but it's a pretty obvious red herring. The real villain is Professor Callahan, who wants revenge against Gray after his invention caused his daughter to go missing. Much like Hans from the previous movie, Callahan's transition into a villain seems to come out of nowhere to the point that he almost feels like a different character.
Tadashi, just let him die.
Give me the mask, hero.
He went in there to save you.
That was his mistake.
But outside of these issues, Big Hero 6 is not only a lot of fun, but has a powerful and effective message. I guess I should have called this movie Big Hero 7, because I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. I'm so tired. Now we get to another movie I was really looking forward to revisiting, Zootopia. When I first heard about this movie and saw the trailers, I knew I wanted to see it, but I had no idea how much I would end up loving it. Zootopia is my favorite Disney movie from the 2010s, and possibly one of my top 5 favorite animated Disney movies in general. Let's start with my favorite aspect of this movie, which is how it shows the dangers of prejudice. It uses the differences between the different animals as an allegory for race relations in the US. There had been other Disney movies like Hunchback that sort of dealt with the theme of prejudice, but Zootopia goes much more in depth, tackling issues like discrimination, stereotypes, and racial profiling. At the same time though, it handles these issues in a way that makes them accessible without necessarily talking down to the audience. Some may argue that this weakens the impact of the message, but like I said, it never feels like the film is dumbing down the issues it tackles. And it does so pretty subtly, at least by Disney standards. The message never feels too preachy or in your face. It also helped that this movie came out right as the 2016 presidential election was getting started, which would end up having all sorts of negative effects on the country, so it was nice to have a film that gives some hope for future generations. I've heard people argue that the racial allegory in this film doesn't really work, and I'm sure if you dug hard enough you would find some issues, but the fact that the allegory works as well as it does is a huge achievement. I've also heard people accuse Zootopia of being propaganda, and honestly, I don't agree with that sentiment at all. Sure, the plays aren't really the villains of the story, but they're not portrayed in the most sympathetic light either. Overall, it has a really powerful message for a Disney movie. But even outside the message of acceptance, Zootopia has so many elements that make it work, especially its characters. Judy Hopps is one of Disney's most likable and sympathetic protagonists, with how she wants to make her world a better place by becoming a cop, even when everyone in the city pushes her around.
You ready to make the world a better place?
And plus, I don't know, there's just something about her. Oh god, it's happening.
Jeepers! I'm a bully!
Alright, let's change the subject. She also forms a great dynamic with Nick Wilde, where despite the two being so different, they gradually form a deep friendship. At the same time though, their friendship is put to the test when Judy has to confront her own prejudices, which leads to quite possibly the most poignant line in the whole film.
Nick, stop it. You're not like them.
Oh, there's a them now.
The film even has a twist villain, but unlike the previous villains, you can sort of understand their motives, even if they go way too far. As far as the visuals go, they're just as astounding. It's amazing to see Disney go from Chicken Little, where they struggle to render basic textures, to having amazing textures, lighting, and cinematography in Zootopia. On top of that, the animators put a lot of detail into the city of Zootopia, showing the different environments and how different types of animals live their lives in the city. The character design, reminiscent of Robin Hood, also fits the movie really well. I could talk about this movie all day, but to sum it up, Zootopia is an absolute masterpiece. Not only does it have a powerfully effective message about the dangers of prejudice, but it also has a well-crafted story, interesting characters, and some of Disney's best computer animation. Does this movie even have any flaws? The Shakira song in it kinda sucks, I guess. And, yeah, that's about it. This movie's perfect, 10 out of 10. On the same year as Zootopia, Disney released Moana, which marked the return of legendary Disney directors Ron Clements and John Musker, along with Big Hero 6 directors Don Hall and Chris Williams. This was actually their first time directing a computer-animated film, and they got off to a really good start. Moana is a really fun return to Disney's animated musical genre. Let's start with one of the film's strongest aspects, the two leads, the titular character Moana, and the demigod Maui. Moana is one of Disney's more memorable princess characters with a strong personality and sympathetic goal to save her home island, along with a really good voice performance by Aulei Cravado, which is especially impressive considering she was only 16 when she recorded her lines.
See the light where the sky meets the sea, it calls me, and no one knows how far it goes.
Maui is also a lot of fun, starting off as selfish and egotistical before gradually forming a bond with Moana. And once again, Dwayne Johnson does a really good job voicing him.
It's actually Maui, shapeshifter, demigod of the wind and sea, hero of men. I interrupted from the top.
The side characters, like Moana's grandma, her chicken Hei, and Shefrudis' favorite character Tamatoa, are also really enjoyable but don't really get enough screen time in my opinion. Another minor issue is that the story, despite having a really good setup, feels like it drags on a bit in the middle with a lot of scenes that don't advance the plot. At the same time though, the story does do a good job of incorporating Polynesian mythology into the story. You can tell that the filmmakers tried really hard to be respectful to their cultures. But in my opinion, the best part of Moana has to be its animation. Of course, the character animation, cinematography, lighting, and environments are extremely detailed and beautiful to look at. The animation's biggest achievement, though, has to be how they animated the water. Any animator will tell you how hard it can be to animate water in a believable way. But not only did the animators here pull it off really well, but they even turned the ocean into its own character, guiding Moana on her adventure. They even managed to incorporate some 2D animation with Maui's tattoos, which was really nice to see. The songs were composed by Lin-Manuel Miranda of Hamilton fame, and they're another really memorable element. All the songs are great, but my favorite is probably Moana's song How Far I'll Go. I also really like Tamatoa's song Shiny. The decision to make it as a David Bowie pastiche was a really odd choice, but it worked surprisingly well and is one of the catchier numbers in the film.
I'd rather be shiny like a treasure from a sunken pirate wreck. Scrub the deck and make it look shiny.
So, despite some minor issues like some weak side characters and an iffy story, Moana is still a modern Disney classic with strong main characters, gorgeous animation, and unforgettable songs. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. After a 2-year hiatus, Disney Animation finally returned with Ralph Breaks the Internet, which, as a side note, is probably the worst title of any animated Disney film. After the first Wreck-It Ralph came out, I remember hearing the creators talk about how they wanted to do a sequel focusing on console and online gaming. I thought this was a really intriguing idea with a lot of possibilities. The movie we ended up getting, however, focuses much more on the internet side, and in my opinion it wasn't handled in the best way. Honestly, Ralph Breaks the Internet is one of those movies that gets worse and worse the more times I watch it. I still hesitate to call it bad, but it's definitely a downgrade from the first movie. Let's start with probably my biggest problem, which is how Ralph's character was handled. I was surprised by how immature he acts in this story. Yeah, I know Ralph could be a little immature in the first movie, but here he almost acts like a child. This is evident from the start of the story, when Ralph accidentally causes Sugar Rush to break and get unplugged, which he doesn't seem to take responsibility for at first. But later Ralph tries to make things right by taking Vanellope to the internet so they can get a new controller for the game from eBay. Or as Ralph calls it, E-Boy, which, as a side note, it's pretty funny that there's a Disney movie that says E-Boy multiple times.
An actual E-Boy.
But Ralph's immaturity really starts to show when Vanellope decides to move on to another racing game, causing Ralph to selfishly try to sabotage her efforts. I get that the point is that Ralph learns to accept Vanellope's desires, but until then he acts uncharacteristically selfish and childish. On the other hand though, I can kinda see why Ralph would be upset as Vanellope made the decision pretty suddenly without talking about it with him first. So there's definitely some problems on both sides of this conflict, but I still think Ralph feels a bit off compared to the first movie. Another problem is how this movie portrays the internet. It uses a lot of dated memes and references in its humor, which end up making the movie feel a bit out of touch. This is most evident during the Oh My Disney sequence, which is really just a way for Disney to show off all the franchises they own. Although the scene with the princesses is kinda funny.
Were you poisoned?
No. Cursed? No. Kidnapped or enslaved? No. Are you guys okay? Should I call the police?
And don't get me started on when Ralph does the floss. I know I've been pretty negative so far, but there are some things in this movie that work pretty well, especially its animation. The artists put a lot of detail into the world of the internet, making it feel absolutely massive. The inhabitants of the internet also have a wide variety of art styles. I especially like the design of Nosmore, who has a very UPA look to him. However, some of the designs remind me a bit too much of the Emoji Movie. And if anything in this movie reminds me of that film, that's a bad sign. I also like how this movie doesn't have a clear antagonist, instead having the characters face a virus that ends up being a manifestation of Ralph's insecurities. Even then, you could argue that the virus is just doing what it was programmed to do and doesn't have any malicious intentions. There's also a nice message of supporting your friends even when they take a different path from you. Once again, I think Ralph took too long to learn that message, but it's still a nice moral. Overall, Ralph Breaks the Internet is a bit disappointing, despite having some positive qualities. Maybe the only reason I'm being so negative is because I love the original Wreck-It Ralph so much, but the movie's handling of its main characters and dated depiction of the internet really weigh it down. Also, this movie has a cameo from Connie Ballinger, and that alone is enough for me to dock a point from it.
I'm not a groomer.
5 out of 10. The 2010s were definitely a period of renewed success for Disney animation, with almost all of the movies in that period becoming both critical and commercial smash hits. But towards the end of the decade, the studio would once again go through some big management changes. In late 2018, Ed Catmull retired from his positions at Pixar and Walt Disney Animation Studios. While this was certainly a big change, it was preceded by an even bigger event earlier that year, when John Lasseter stepped down from his positions at both studios after facing sexual harassment allegations. To be clear, the allegations against Lasseter weren't nearly as bad as what people like Kevin Spacey and Harvey Weinstein were accused of around the same time, but he still made many Disney and Pixar employees uncomfortable, so I think it was for the best that he left. And judging by how Lasseter has been treating the employees at his new studio, Skydance Animation, I'm feeling more confident in that assessment. Anyways, Lasseter's position at Disney Animation was filled by Jennifer Lee, which must have been really stressful for her as she was already working on her next movie, and the next one we'll be discussing, Frozen 2. Given how much of a phenomenon the first Frozen was, making a sequel was basically a no-brainer. What surprised me, though, was that it actually outgrossed the original Frozen, making it Walt Disney Animation Studios' most successful movie. And if you don't count the Lion King remake as animated, then it's currently the highest-grossing animated film of all time. I was pretty interested when I saw the first trailers, as it looked like it would expand on the lore of the first movie and take the story in a bit of a darker and more serious direction. While the movie fulfills both of those expectations, it still isn't quite as good as the first movie. I guess I should get the negatives out of the way first. For one thing, Kristoff doesn't have nearly as much personality in this movie as it did in the first, and a subplot of trying to propose to Anna, while pretty cute by itself, doesn't really add anything to the overall story, and kind of feels like a repeat of Bernard's story in The Rescuers Down Under. Another character that kind of received a downgrade is Olaf. Remember in my review for the first Frozen where I said that I thought Olaf would be really annoying, but I ended up liking him? Well, Olaf in this movie is kind of how I expected him to be in the first one. Sure, he still has his funny moments, but his comedic antics feel pretty out of place compared to the rest of the movie's somewhat serious tone.
Samantha? I don't even know it's Samantha.
And despite this movie having the same songwriting team as the first film, Robert and Kristen Anderson Lopez, I don't think the songs here are nearly as memorable as the earlier ones. The only exceptions are Into the Unknown and Show Yourself, but even those feel like they're just trying to be the next Let It Go.
Into the unknown. Into the unknown. Into the unknown.
But still, there are some pretty big positives in this film. Like I said earlier, this movie does a great job of expanding on the lore of the first Frozen. This includes explaining how Elsa got her powers and giving some backstory to her and Anna's parents. There's even a twist involving Anna and Elsa's grandfather that I didn't see coming the first time I saw it. The story, as I mentioned earlier, also goes in a bit of a darker and more interesting direction, although the tone sometimes switches between being dramatic and comedic at random. The animation also received an upgrade from before, with improved textures, lighting, and effects, on top of creating new environments and adding to Elsa's ice powers in really creative ways. So overall, while it's not quite as strong as its predecessor, Frozen 2 is still a decent sequel. 6 out of 10. Up next is Raya and the Last Dragon, another movie that was made during a period of change for Disney. In early 2020, Bob Iger stepped down as the CEO of the Walt Disney Company and was replaced by Bob Chapek. But then Chapek proved to be so incompetent that Iger came back just 2.5 years later.
That was pointless.
But outside of that, the world was also entering a scary new era as the COVID-19 pandemic began. The pandemic would have a hugely negative impact on the film industry by canceling most theatrical releases. Raya was no exception to this. It was originally scheduled for a theatrical release in November 2020, but ended up being delayed to March 2021, when it came out both in theaters and on Disney+, albeit against a paywall, a pretty bad practice that Disney has thankfully stopped doing. It's a shame that Raya had to go through so many difficulties, as I found it to be a really fun ride. The thing that really makes this movie stand out is its world building. Rather than being set on Earth, Raya takes place in a fantasy world, something I don't think Disney had done since the Black Cauldron. The film does a great job of explaining the different parts of Kumandra and showing how they differ from one another. It also takes inspiration from cultures of different Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and more. Now, keep in mind that I'm not Southeast Asian, so I don't know how well Disney represented those cultures. I recommend learning from people who do come from that region. But like I said, the world building is still detailed and well thought out. The story and characters are also pretty strong. The titular character Raya has to rebuild the Dragon Gem in order to bring back her father, who along with many other people in the kingdom was turned to stone after the gem was destroyed. Since this happened after Raya trusted Namaari, who betrayed her, it caused her to have a cynical view of the world, something we don't often see from Disney protagonists. Raya and Namaari end up forming a complex and intriguing relationship, though part of me wishes that they could have just become an actual couple. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a judge of the story that did this. The story itself feels a bit darker and more epic than most Disney movies, which makes it stand out. Though admittedly, it sometimes feels like the story has a lot of ground to cover in a limited amount of time, so the pacing can sometimes feel a bit too fast. Another problem I have is with the moral of trusting others. Sure, it's a good message and everything, but the fact that the movie constantly hammers it in your head gets pretty grating. As for the dragon, Sisu, she definitely has her funny moments, but her modern day references sometimes feel out of place in the movie's fantasy setting.
Have you ever done like a group project, but there's like that one kid who didn't pitch in as much, but still ended up with the same grade? Yeah, I wasn't the one who actually made the gem. I just turned it in.
The rest of Raya's sidekicks, while not super complex, are still really fun and likable, especially that baby who always cons people. Like I said, the movie has excellent world building, and the animation is a major part of that. Each region in Kumandra has a unique environment from the other, making the kingdom feel like a real, lived-in place. The effects and creature designs also add to the fantastical nature of the setting. Not to mention that the animation also gives us some intense and well-choreographed action scenes. Another major highlight is the score, composed by James Newton Howard for the first time since Treasure Planet way back in 2002. I'm not sure what took him so long to come back to Disney, but I'm glad he did, as the music adds to the intense tone of the film. While Raya and the Last Dragon has some issues with its storytelling, it more than makes up for it with its imaginative world building, likable characters, epic scope, and exciting action, which is why I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. Our next movie is Encanto, and like Raya and the Last Dragon, it showed how much the film landscape changed in the wake of COVID. Encanto wasn't very successful when it came out in theaters, but when it hit Disney Plus a month later, it became an unexpected phenomenon, probably Disney's biggest since Frozen. And like Frozen, people have extremely varied opinions on this film. What do I think of it? Well, it's pretty good. Honestly, I thought the movie was a bit overhyped when it first became popular, but I can definitely see why a lot of people love it. One thing many people have praised about Encanto, and what I think is one of its strongest aspects, is how it deals with the theme of trying to prove yourself to your family. The protagonist, Mirabel, feels like a burden on her family since she's the only one who doesn't have a special power. Things get even worse when their magic seems to be fading, leading everyone to blame Mirabel for it while she tries to set things right. I think a lot of people who come from toxic families can relate to Mirabel's struggles, especially her relationship with Abuela. Abuela is particularly hard on Mirabel throughout the entire film, and it's really satisfying when Mirabel and her parents finally call her out towards the end.
I will never be good enough for you. Will I?
The movie also does a pretty good job of explaining why Abuela acts the way she does, though honestly I feel like maybe she got off a bit too easily. But regardless, Encanto's message of familial bond is pretty refreshing for a Disney movie. Though am I the only one who feels like the story is pretty low stakes for a Disney movie? Like, most Disney movies involve some huge villain or obstacle the characters have to overcome, but this movie's just about saving a house and the family's powers. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like the story could have used a little more tension. The side characters are all really likable too, including Mirabel's sisters and cousins and her uncle Bruno. The only problem is that since there are so many family members, they don't all get a chance to shine, and I wish we could have gotten to see more of some of them. Of course, the animation is amazing, though at this point I feel like saying a Disney movie has great animation is kind of like saying that humans breathe oxygen. The movie gets really creative with the different magical members' powers, in addition to bringing the house to life and almost treating it like its own character. The environments are also really well designed. Not only do they bring out the natural beauty of Colombia, but each bedroom of the family members is unique and reflects their respective powers and personalities. The songs were once again done by Lin-Manuel Miranda, and while they're not quite as good or memorable as the songs for Moana, they still provide a lot of entertainment. My favorites are probably either the opening song, The Family Madrigal, or the song that made this movie so popular, We Don't Talk About Bruno. Like Let It Go, this song has definitely been overplayed, but it's still one of the standout numbers of the whole film.
We don't talk about Bruno, no, no, no. We don't talk about Bruno.
Overall, while I wouldn't call Encanto one of Disney's best animated films, I can definitely see why it has such a huge fan base. Despite some minor problems with its story and characters, the film makes up for it with gorgeous animation, memorable songs, and a heartfelt message. 7 out of 10. And now we come to the most recent movie Walt Disney Animation Studios has put out, as of this recording, Strange World. Once again, this movie faced some difficulties when it first came out in theaters, but unlike Encanto, it ended up as Disney's biggest financial flop since Treasure Planet. Though honestly, I feel like this failure had more to do with Disney not marketing the film properly than anything relating to the pandemic. And really, Strange World didn't deserve it, because while it's not perfect, it still has a lot to like. Similar to Raya and The Last Dragon, Strange World has extremely creative world building. The planet the characters live in has the perfect blend of sci-fi technology and earthly environments. But unlike Treasure Planet, it doesn't quite go full steampunk and instead tries something much more unique. The same goes for the other world the characters explore, the titular Strange World. The environment is full of bizarre creatures and unique, colorful landscapes. I also like how the movie's style emulates pulp sci-fi comics and movies, which adds to the theme of combining the old with the new. The only thing about the visuals I don't love is the character design, which can be pretty inconsistent. Some characters look similar to the usual Disney style, while others like Searcher and Jaeger have this weird cartoony look where their eyes are really close together. On the one hand, I appreciate Disney using designs that don't fit into the style they normally use, but the character designs still feel a bit off to me. As for the story and characters, they're not quite as unique or engaging as the visuals, but there's still some things to like. The movie mainly focuses on the relationship between Searcher Clade and his estranged father, Jaeger, and how their personalities often clash, with Jaeger being a brave adventurer who always looking for a challenge, while Searcher is more cautious and wants a quieter life. It can be really fun to see how these two differ, but their dynamic gets old after a while and feels too similar to other movies focusing on a father-son dynamic. This also applies to Searcher and his son, Ethan, who basically have the same relationship as Goofy and Max in a Goofy movie.
You're a kid! You don't know what you want!
I know I don't want to be you!
On the bright side though, Ethan is actually the first character from Walt Disney Animation Studios to be openly gay, and the movie handles it really well without making it seem like they're pandering to the LGBTQ community. It's kinda sad that it took us almost 100 years to get to this point, but hey, better late than never, I guess. Anyways, while the characters aren't the strongest aspect of the movie, it still does a good job of telling an exciting adventure story, along with some interesting twists that tie into the world building. It's not the most deep or original story out there, but it's still pretty fun. That's honestly a pretty good way to sum up Strange World. It isn't revolutionary or anything, but it is a pretty fun sci-fi adventure with some really creative world building. It's a pretty good place to leave off on for Disney Animation, which is why I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. And hey, since I don't live in Florida, I can watch this movie without getting in trouble from the government. And with that, after 61 animated films, we have finally come to the end of this marathon. Watching these movies in chronological order always makes me appreciate them more. It's fascinating to see how Disney's animation and storytelling have evolved since Snow White. But no matter how different the movies are from each other, they always stick to the Disney tradition of telling compelling stories with lovable characters. For the most part. I think it says a lot about the studio's quality standards that out of their 61 feature films, there are only 3 that I consider to be below average. In fact, if you want to know how much I love Disney, you may remember a certain video I made 6 years ago that may have unexpectedly gone viral. Yep, that was me. Honestly, the fact that a dumb little meme video that probably took me a total of 2 hours to make managed to get so many views shows how much of an impact the studio has had. Disney has gone through many ups and downs over their 100-year history, and people have all sorts of positive and negative views on the company. But no matter what your thoughts are on Disney, I'm willing to bet that there's at least one animated film of theirs that you absolutely love. Walt Disney Animation Studios has undoubtedly made a huge impact not just on the animation industry, or even the film industry, but on pop culture in general. They help show that animation can appeal to people of all ages and backgrounds. It isn't just a cheap money-making tool. I wish more people would understand just how much hard work the animators put into these movies, which have helped them last for generations and will probably last for generations to come. I'm beyond excited to see what the future holds for Disney animation, and I can't wait to see Wish when it comes out later this year. But no matter what the studio does in the future, their legacy is already stronger than any other studio out there. But now I'd like to hear from you. Let me know in the comments what your favorite Disney movies are, and if you agree or disagree with any of my points. Just try to be respectful. And above all, thank you for joining me on this journey. And thank you to all of the artists of Walt Disney Animation Studios who have helped make some of the greatest movies of all time.